Put the music back on. Tiro with first again. Oh man. Okay. And apologies to everyone for the duplicate Discord ping. I do not know what happened. So, but we're back and we're ready to go. So anyway, as I was saying, is that where we last left off was okay, hold on. There we go. Beautiful, beautiful. So we last left off that Annie had left and she was going to her happy place. And we did not know how long she was going to be gone at all. And I believe she had already been gone for a decent amount of time. And Paul decided he had had enough and got out of his room again to assess the situation and found that there was no way for him to get to the downstairs cellar to get anything down there because stairs and he's in a wheelchair currently. And there was no way for him to get out of either of the doors and get to the road because it is too muddy and he would get stuck and freeze to death. So for the time being, and because the phone doesn't work and he can't call out, he is trapped and just has to survive. And that is where we are. And we'll continue. Part 2, number 17. Annie's larder looked more like a survivalist's bomb shelter than a pantry. He guessed that some of this hoarding was a simple nod to the realities of her situation. She was a woman alone, living in the high country, where a person must reasonably expect to spend a certain period, maybe only a day, but sometimes as long as a week or even 2, cut off from the rest of the world. Probably even those cock-a-doodle Roidmans had a pantry that would make a homeowner from another part of the country raise his or her brows. But he doubted if the cock-a-doodle Roidmans, or anyone else up here, had anything which came close to what he was looking at now. This was no pantry. This was a goddamn supermarket. He supposed there was a certain symbolism in Annie's pantry. The ranks of goods had something to say about the murkiness of the borderline between the sovereign state of reality and the People's Republic of paranoia. In his current situation, however, such niceties hardly seemed worth examination. Fuck the symbolism. Go for the food. Yes, but be careful. It wasn't just a matter of what she might miss. He must take no more than he could reasonably hope to hide if she came back suddenly. And how else did he think she would come? Her phone was dead, and he somehow doubted if Annie would send him a telegram or flowers by wire. But in the end, what she might miss in here or find in his room hardly mattered. After all, he had to eat. He was hooked on that, too. Sardines. There were lots of sardines in those flat rectangular cans with the key under the paper. Good. He would have some of those, tins of deviled ham, no keys, but he could open a couple of cans in her kitchen and eat those first. Bury the empties deep in her own overflowing garbage. There was an open package of sun-made raisins containing smaller boxes, which the ad copy on the torn cellophane wrapper called mini snacks. Paul added 4 of the mini snacks to the growing stash in his lap, plus single-serving boxes of cornflakes and Wheaties. He noted there were no single-serving boxes of pre-sweetened cereals. If there had been, Annie had had chowed them down on her last binge. Hi, Tyler. Yep, you are here. Welcome in. On a higher shelf was a pile of Slim Jims, as neatly stacked as the kindling in Annie's shed. He took 4, trying not to disturb the pyramidal structure of the pile, and ate one of them greedily, relishing the salty taste and the grease. He tucked the wrapping into his underwear for later disposal. His legs were beginning to hurt. He decided that if he wasn't going to escape or burn the house down, he had to go on back to his own room. An anticlimax, but things could be worse. He could take a couple of pills, then write until he got drowsy. Then he could go to sleep. He doubted if she would be back tonight, far from abating. The storm was gaining strength. The idea of writing quietly and then sleeping with the knowledge that he was perfectly alone, that Annie was not going to burst in with some wild idea or even wilder demand, held great appeal, anticlimax or not. He reversed out of the pantry, pausing to turn off the light, reminding himself that he must, rinse, put everything back in order as he made his retreat. If he ran out of food before she came back, he could always return for more, like a hungry rat. Right, Polly? But he must not forget how careful he must be. He would not do to forget the simple fact that he was risking his life every time he left his room. Forgetting that would not do at all. As he was rolling across the parlor, the scrapbook under the coffee table caught his eye again. Memory Lane. It was as big as a folio Shakespeare play and as thick as a family Bible. Curious, he picked it up and opened it. On the first page was a single column of newsprint, headed Wilkes-Barreman Nuptials. There was a picture of a pale gent with a narrow face and a woman with dark eyes and a pursy mouth. Paul glanced from the newspaper photo to the portrait over the mantel. No question. The woman identified in the clipping as Crisilda Berryman, now there's a name worthy of a misery novel, he thought, was Annie's mother. Neatly written in black ink below the clipping was Bakersfield Journal, May 30th, 1938. Page 2 was a birth announcement. Paul Emery Wilkes, born in Bakersfield Receiving Hospital, May 12th, 1939. Father, Carl Wilkes, mother, Crisilda Wilkes. The name of Annie's older brother gave him a start. He must have been the one with whom she had gone to the movies and seen the chapter plays. Her brother had been Paul, too. Page 3 announced the birth of Annie Marie Wilkes. Date of birth, April 1st, 1943, which made Annie just past her 44th birthday. The fact that she had been born on April Fool's Day did not escape him. Outside, the wind gusted, rain tore against the house. Fascinated, his pain temporarily forgotten, Paul turned to the page. The neat clipping was from page 1 of the Bakersfield Journal. The photo showed a fireman on a ladder, silhouetted against the background of flames billowing from the windows of a frame building. 5 died in apartment house fire. 5 persons, 4 of them members of the same family, died in the early hours of Wednesday morning, victims of a smoky 3-alarm fire in a Bakersfield apartment house on Watch Hill Avenue. 3 of the dead were children: Paul Kremitz, 8, Frederick Kremitz, 6, and Allison Kremitz, 3. The 4th was their father, Adrian Kremitz, 41. Mr. Kremitz rescued the surviving Kremitz child, Lorene Kremitz, who is 8 months old. According to Mrs. Jessica Kremitz, her husband put the youngest of their 4 children in her arms and told her, "I'll be back with the others in a minute or 2. Pray for us." "I never saw him again," she said. The 5th victim, Irving Ballman, 58, was a bachelor who lived on the top floor of the building. 3rd floor apartment was vacant at the time of the fire. The Carl Wilkes family, at first listed as missing, left the building Tuesday night because of a water leak in the kitchen. "I weep for Mrs. Kremitz and her loss," Crisilda Wilkes told a Journal reporter, "but I thank God for sparing my husband and my own 2 children." Centralia Fire Chief Michael Owen said that the fire began in the apartment building's basement. When asked about the possibility of arson, he said, "It's more likely that a wino crept into the basement, had a few drinks, and accidentally started the fire with a cigarette. He probably ran instead of trying to put the fire out, and 5 people died. I hope we catch up with the bum." When asked about leads, Owen said, "The police have several, and they're following them up hard and fast, I can tell you." Same neat black ink below the clipping. October 28th, 1954. Paul looked up. He was totally still, but a pulse beat rapidly in his throat. His bowels felt loose and hot. Little brats. Three of the dead were children. Mrs. Krement's 4 brats downstairs. Oh, Christ, no. I used to hate those little brats. She was just a kid, not even in the house. She was 11, old enough and bright enough, maybe, to spill some kerosene around a cheap liquor bottle, then light a candle and put the candle in the middle of the kerosene. Maybe she didn't even think it would work. Maybe she thought the kerosene would evaporate before the candle burned all the way down. Maybe she thought they'd get out alive. Only wanted to scare them into moving. But she did it, Paul. She fucking did it. And you know it. Yes, he supposed he did. And who would suspect her? He turned the page. Here was yet another Bakersfield Journal clipping, this one dated July 19th, 1957. It featured a picture of Carl Wilkes looking slightly older. One thing was clear, it was as old as he was ever going to get. The clipping was his obituary. Bakersfield accountant dies in freak fall. Carl Wilkes, a lifelong Bakersfield resident, died shortly after being admitted to Hernandez General Hospital last night. He apparently stumbled over a pile of loose clothing which had been left on the stairs earlier while on his way down to answer the phone. Dr. Frank Canley, the administering physician, said that Wilkes died of multiple skull fractures and a broken neck. He was 44. Wilkes is survived by his wife, Griselda, a son, Paul, 18, and a daughter, Annie, 14. When Paul turned to the next page, he thought for a moment that Annie had pasted in 2 copies of her father's obituary out of sentiment or by accident. He thought this latter the more likely possibility of the two. But this was a different accident, and the reason for the similarity was simplicity itself. Neither had really been an accident at all. He felt stark and simple terror steal into him. The neat handwriting below this clipping read, Los Angeles, Cal, January 29th, 1962. USC student dies in freak fall. Andrea St. James, a USC nursing student, was pronounced dead on arrival at Mercy Hospital in North Los Angeles last night, the apparent victim of a bizarre accident. Miss St. James shared an off-campus apartment on DeLorme Street with a sister nursing student, Annie Wilkes, of Bakersfield. Shortly before 11 p.m., Miss Wilkes heard a brief scream followed by terrible thudding sounds. Miss Wilkes, who had been studying, rushed onto the 3rd-floor landing and saw Miss St. James lying on the landing below, sprawled in a very unnatural position. Miss Wilkes said that in her effort to render aid, she almost fell herself. "We had a cat named Peter Gunn," she said. "Only we hadn't seen him for days and thought the pound must have gotten him because we kept forgetting to get him a tag. He was lying dead on the stairs. It was the cat she tripped over. I covered Andrea with my sweater and called the hospital. I knew she was dead, but I didn't know who else to call." Miss St. James, a native of Los Angeles, was 21. Jesus. Paul whispered it over and over. His hand was shaking badly as he turned the page. There was a call clipping which said that the stray cat the student nurses adopted had been poisoned. Peter Gunn. Cute name for a cat, Paul thought. The landlord had rats in his basement. Tenant complaints had resulted in a warning from the building inspectors the year before. The landlord had caused a ruckus at a subsequent city council meeting, which had been lively enough to get coverage by the papers. Annie would have known. Faced with a stiff fine by councilmen who didn't like being called names, the landlord had sown the cellar with poison bait. Cat eats poison. Cat languishes in cellar for 2 days. Cat then crawls as close to his mistress as possible before expiring and killing one of said mistresses. An irony worthy of Paul Harvey, Paul Sheldon thought, and laughed wildly. I bet it made his daily newscast, too. Neat. Very neat. Except we know that Annie picked up some of the poisoned bait in the cellar and hand-fed it to the cat, and if old Peter Gunn didn't want to eat it, she probably rammed it down his gullet with a stick. When he was dead, she put him on the stairs and hoped it would work. Maybe she had a pretty good idea her roommate would come home tiddly. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Dead cat, a heap of clothes, say mamo, as Tom Twyford would say. But why, Annie? These clippings tell me everything but that. Why? In an act of self-preservation, part of his imagination had, over the last few weeks, actually become Annie. And it was now this Annie part that spoke up in his dry and uncontrollable voice. And while what it said was perfectly mad, it also made perfect sense. I killed her because she played her radio late at night. I killed her because of the dumb name she gave the cat. I killed her because I got tired of seeing her soul kissing her boyfriend on the couch. Him with his hand shoved so far up her skirt, he looked like he was prospecting for gold. Sorry, I got a text. I killed her because I caught her cheating. I killed her because she caught me cheating. The specifics don't matter, do they? I killed her because she was a cocky-doody brat, and that was reason enough. And maybe because she was a Mrs. Smart Guy, Paul whispered. He threw back his head and docking another shrill and frightened laugh. So this was memory lane, was it? Oh, what a variety of strange and poisonous flowers grew inside Annie's version of that quaint old path. No one ever put those two freak falls together? First her father, then her roommate? Are you seriously telling me that? Yes, he was seriously telling himself that. The accidents had happened almost 5 years apart in 2 different towns. They had been reported by different papers in a populous state where people were probably always falling downstairs and breaking their necks. And she was very, very clever. Almost as clever as Satan himself, it seemed. Only now she was starting to lose it. It would be precious little consolation to him, however, if Annie were to be finally brought to bay for the murder of Paul Sheldon. He turned the page and discovered another clipping from the Bakersfield Journal, the last, as it turned out. The headline read, Miss Wilkes is nursing school graduate. Hometown girl makes good, May 17th, 1966. The photo was of a younger, startlingly pretty Annie Wilkes, wearing a nurse's uniform and cap, smiling into the camera. It was a graduation photograph, of course. She had graduated with honors. Only had to kill one roommate to do it, too, Paul thought, and donkeyed a shrill, frightened laugh. The wind gusted around the side of the house as if in answer. Mom's picture chattered briefly on the wall. The next cutting was from the Manchester, New Hampshire Union Leader, March 2nd, 1969. It was a simple obituary which seemed to have no connection with Annie Wilkes at all. Ernest Gonyar, age 79, had died in St. Joseph's Hospital, no exact cause of death given. After a long illness, the obit said, survived by his wife, 12 children, and what looked like about 400 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. There was nothing like the rhythm method for producing all descendants, great and small, Paul thought, and donkeyed again. She killed him. That's what happened to good old Ernie. Why else is his obituary here? This is Annie's Book of the Dead, isn't it? Why, for God's sake, why? With Annie Wilkes, that is a question which has no sane answer, as you well know. Another page, another Union Leader obit, March 19th, 1969. The lady was identified as Hester Queenie Oliphant, 84. In the picture, she looked like something whose bones might have been exhumed from the La Brea tar pits. The same thing that had gotten Ernie had gotten Queenie. Seemed like that long illness shit was going around. Like Ernie, she had expired at St. Joe's. Viewings at 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock on March 20th at Foster's Funeral Home. Intermittent at Mary Sears Cemetery on March 21st at 4 p.m. Internment. I can't read. I'd like to have had a special rendition of Annie, Won't You Come By Here, sung in the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, Paul thought, and did the donkey some more. There were 3 more Union Leader obits on the following pages. 2 old men who had died from that perennial favorite, long illness. The third was a woman of 46 named Paulette Simo. Paulette had died of that common runner-up, short illness, although the picture accompanying the obit was even grainier and fuzzier than usual. Paul saw that Paulette Sino made Queenie Oliphant look like Thumbelina. He thought her illness might have been short indeed, a thunderclap coronary, say, followed by a trip to St. Joe's, followed by what? Exactly what? He didn't really want to think about the specifics, but all three obits identified St. Joseph's as the place of expiration. And if we looked at the nurse's register for March 1969, would we find the name Wilkes? Friends, does a bear go cock-a-doodle in the woods? This book, dear God, this book was so big. No more, please. I don't want to look at any more. I've got the idea. I'm going to put this book down exactly where I found it. Today I'm going into my room. I guess I don't want to write after all. I think I'll just take an extra pill and go to bed. Call it nightmare insurance, but no farther down Annie's memory lane, if you please. Please, if you please. But his hands seemed to have a mind and a will of their own. He kept on turning the pages faster and faster. 2 more brief death notices in the Union Leader, one in late September of 1969, one in early October. March 19th, 1970, this one was from the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Herald. A back page. New hospital staff announced. There was a photo of a balding, bespectacled man who looked to Paul like the type of fellow who might eat boogers in secret. The article noted that in addition to the new publicity director, the balding, bespectacled fellow, 20 others had joined the staff of Riverview Hospital, 2 doctors, 8 RNs, assorted kitchen staff, orderlies, and a janitor. Annie was one of the RNs. On the next page, Paul thought, I'm going to see a brief death notice for an elderly man or woman who expired at Riverview Hospital in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's great. Oh my gosh. I tried to talk too fast after taking a drink. Correct. An old duffer who died of that all-time favorite, long illness. Followed by an elderly man who had died of that perennial bridesmaid, short illness. Followed by a child of 3 who had fallen down a well, sustained grievous head injuries, and been brought to Riverview in a coma. Numbly, Paul continued to turn the pages while the wind and rain drove around the house. The pattern was inescapable. She got a job, killed some people, and moved on. Suddenly, an image came, one from a dream his conscious mind had already forgotten, which thus gained the Delphic resonance of déjà vu. He saw Annie Wilkes in a long aproned dress, her hair covered with a mob cap, and Annie who looked like a nurse in London's Bedlam Hospital. She held a basket over one arm. She dipped into it, brought out sand, and flung it into the upturned faces she passed. This was not the soothing sand of sleep, but poisoned sand. It was killing them. When it struck them, their faces went white, and the lines on the machines monitoring their precarious lives went flat. Maybe she killed the Kremens kids because they were brats, and her roommate, maybe even her own father. But these others? But he knew. The Annie in him knew. Old and sick. All of them had been old and sick except Mrs. Simo. And she must have been nothing but a vegetable when she came in. Mrs. Simo and the kid who had fallen down the well. Annie had killed them because they were rats in a trap, he whispered. Poor things. Poor things. Sure, that was it. In Annie's view, all the people in the world were divided into 3 groups. Brats, poor things, and Annie. She had moved steadily westward, Harrisburg to Pittsburgh to Duluth to Fargo. Then in 1978 to Denver. In each case, the pattern was the same. A welcome aboard article in which Annie's name was mentioned among others. She had missed the Manchester welcome aboard, probably because, Paul guessed, she hadn't known that local newspaper printed such things. Then 2 or 3 unremarkable deaths. Following these, the cycle would start again. Until Denver, that was. At first, it seemed the same. There was the new arrivals article, this time clipped from the in-house newspaper of Denver's receiving hospital with Annie's name mentioned. The in-house paper was identified in Annie's neat hand as the Gurney. Great name for a hospital paper, Paul told the empty room. Surprised no one thought of calling it the stool sample. He donkeyed more terrified laughter, all unaware. Turned the page, and here was the first obit, cut from the Rocky Mountain News. Laura D. Rothberg, long illness, September 21st, 1978. Denver Receiving Hospital. Then the pattern broke wide open. The next page announced a wedding instead of a funeral. The photo showed Annie not in her uniform, but in a white dress, frothing with lace. Beside her, holding her hands in his, was a man named Ralph Dugan. Dugan was a physical therapist. Dugan Wilkes Nuptials, the clipping was headed. Rocky Mountain News, January 2nd, 1979. Dugan was quite unremarkable, save for one thing. He looked like Annie's father. Paul thought if he shaved off Dugan's singles bar mustache, which she had probably gotten him to do as soon as the honeymoon was over, the resemblance would be just short of uncanny. Paul thumbed the thickness of the remaining pages in Annie's book and thought Ralph Dugan should have checked his horoscope. Make that horror-scope the day he proposed to Annie. I think the chances are very good that somewhere up ahead in these unturned pages I'm going to find a brief article about you. Some people have appointments in Samara. I think you may well have had one with a pile of laundry or a dead cat on a flight of stairs. A dead cat with a cute name. But he was wrong. The next clipping was a new arrivals from the Nederland paper. Nederland was a small town just west of Boulder. Not all that far from here, Paul judged. For a moment, he couldn't find Annie in the short, name-filled clipping, but then realized he was looking for the wrong name. She was here, but had become part of a socio-sexual corporation called Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Dugan. Paul's head snapped up. Was that a car coming? No, just the wind. Surely the wind. He looked back down at Annie's book. Ralph Dugan had gone back to helping the lame, the halt, and the blind at Arapahoe County Hospital. Presumably, Annie went back to that time-honored nurse's job of giving aid and comfort to the grievously wounded. Now the killing starts, he thought. The only real question is about Ralph. Does he come at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end? But he was wrong again. Instead of an obit, the next clipping showed a Xerox of a realtor's one-sheet. In the upper left corner of the ad was a photo of a house. Paul recognized it only by the attached barn. He had, after all, never seen the house itself from the outside. Beneath, in Annie's neat, firm hand, earnest money paid March 3rd, 1979. Papers passed March 18th, 1979. Retirement home? Paul doubted it. Summer place? No, they couldn't afford the luxuries, so... Well, maybe it was just a fantasy, but try this. Maybe she really loves old Ralph Dugan. Maybe a year has passed and she still can't smell cocky-duty on him. Something has sure changed. There have been no obituaries since... He flicked back to see. Since Laura Rothberg in September 1978, she stopped killing around the same time she met Ralph. That was then, and this is now. Now the pressure is starting to build up again. The depressive interludes are coming back. She looks at the old people, the terminally ill, and she thinks about what poor, poor things they are, and maybe she thinks, it's this environment that's depressing me. The miles of tiled corridor, and the smells and the squeak of crepe-soled shoes, and the sounds of people in pain. If I could get out of this place, I'd be all right. So Ralph and Annie had apparently gone back to the land. He turned the page and blinked. Slashed into the bottom of the page was August 43rd, 1880. Fuck you. Sorry, the very not date took me by surprise. August 43rd, 1880. Okay. The paper, thick as it was, had been torn in several places under the fury of the hand which had driven the pen. It was the divorces granted column from the needle-end paper, but he had to turn it over to make sure that Annie and Ralph were a part of it. She had pasted it in upside down. Yes, here they were, Ralph and Annie Dugan, grounds, mental cruelty. Divorced after a short illness, Paul muttered, and again looked up, thinking he heard an approaching car. The wind, only the wind. Still, he'd better get back to the safety of his room. It wasn't just the worsening pain in his legs. He was edging toward a state of terminal freakout. Yeah, August 4th, 43rd. Wild. Wild and strange. But he bent over the book again. In a weird way, it was just too good to put down. It was like a novel so disgusting you just have to finish it. Annie's marriage had been dissolved in a much more legal fashion than Paul had anticipated. It seemed fair to say that the divorce really had been after a short illness. A year and a half of wedded bliss wasn't all that much. They had bought a house in March, and that was not a step you took if you felt that your marriage was falling apart. What happened? Paul didn't know. He could have made up a story, but a story was all it would have been. Then, reading the clipping again, he noticed something suggestive. Angela Ford from John Ford. Kristen Frawley from Stanley Frawley. Dana McLaren from Lee McLaren, and Ralph Dugan from Annie Dugan. There's this American custom, right? No one talks about it much, but it's there. Men propose in the moonlight, women file in court. That's not always how it works, but usually that's it. So what tale does this grammatical structure have to tell? Slip out the back, Jack, Kristen is saying. Make a new plan, Stan. Dana is saying. Drop off the key, Lee, is what Ralph, the only man who's listed first in this column, saying. I think maybe he was saying, let me the hell out of here. Maybe he saw the dead cat on the stairs, Paul said. Next page, another new arrivals article. This one was from Boulder, Colorado, the Camera. There was a photograph of a dozen new staff members standing on the lawn of the Boulder Hospital. Annie was in the second row, her face a blank white circle under her cap with its black stripe. Another opening of another show. The date underneath was March 9th, 1981. She had retaken her maiden name. Boulder. That was where Annie really had gone crazy. He turned the pages faster and faster, his horror mounting, and the two thoughts which kept repeating were, why in God's name didn't they tip faster, and how in God's name did she slip through their fingers? May 10th, 1981, long illness. May 14th, 1981, long illness. May 23rd, long illness. June 9th, short illness. June 15th, short. June 16th, long. Short, long, long, short, long, long, short. The pages stuttered through his fingers. He could smell the faint odor of dried paper paste. Christ, how many did she kill? If it was right to equate each obituary pasted in this book with a murder, then her score was more than 30 people by the end of 1981. All without a single murmur from the authorities. Of course, most of the victims were old, the rest badly hurt, but still, you would think. In 1982, Annie had finally stumbled. The clipping from the January 14th camera showed her blank, stone-like face rendered in newsprint dots below a headline which read, New head maternity ward nurse named. On January 29th, the nursery deaths had begun. Annie had chronicled the whole story in her meticulous way. Paul had no trouble following it. If the people after your hide had found this book, Annie, you would have been in jail or some asylum until the end of time. The first two infant deaths had not aroused suspicion. A story on one had mentioned severe birth defects, but babies, defective or not, weren't the same as old folks dying of renal failure or car crash victims brought in still somehow alive in spite of heads which were only half there, or steering wheel-sized holes in their guts. And then she had begun killing the healthy along with the damaged. He supposed that, in her deepening psychotic spiral, she had begun to see all of them as poor, poor things. By mid-March of 1982, there had been 5 nursery deaths in the Boulder Hospital. A full-scale investigation was launched. On March 24th, the camera named a probable culprit as tainted formula. A reliable hospital source was cited, and Paul wondered if perhaps the source had not been Annie Wilkes herself. Another baby had died in April, 2 in May. Then, from the front page of the June 1st Denver Post, head maternity nurse questioned on infant deaths. No charges made as yet, Sheriff's Office spokeswoman says, by Michael Leith. Annie Wilkes, the 39-year-old head nurse with the maternity ward at Boulder Hospital, is being questioned today about the death of 8 infants, deaths which have taken place over a span of some months. All the deaths took place following Miss Wilkes' appointment. When asked if Miss Wilkes was under arrest, Sheriff's Office spokeswoman Tamara Kinselving said she was not. When asked if Miss Wilkes had come of her own free will to give information in the case, Miss Kinselving replied, "I would have to say that was not the case. Things are a bit more serious than that." Asked if Wilkes had been charged with any crime, Miss Kinselving replied, "No, not as yet." The rest of the article was a rehash of Annie's career. It was obvious that she had moved around a lot, but there was no hint that people in all of Annie's hospitals, not just the one in Boulder, had a way of croaking when she was around. He looked at the accompanying photograph, fascinated. Annie in custody. Dear God, Annie in custody. The idol not fallen, but teetering. Teetering. She was mounting a set of stone steps in the company of a husky policewoman, her face dull, devoid of expression. She was wearing her nurse's uniform and white shoes. Next page. Wilkes released. Mum on interrogation. She'd gotten away with it. Somehow she'd gotten away with it. It was time for her to fade out and show up someplace else. Idaho, Utah, California, maybe. Instead, she went back to work. And instead of new arrivals column from somewhere farther west, there was a huge headline from the Rocky Mountain News front page of July 2nd, 1982. The horror continues. 3 more infant deaths in Boulder Hospital. Yeah, Angel of Death would be what she would be considered. Black Widow is someone who kills their husband, and her husband is still alive. Well, was still alive at this time that we know of. Although if he had died and she had done it, he would have been in there or would be in there later. I don't remember. 2 days later, the authorities arrested a Puerto Rican orderly, only to release him 9 hours later. Then on July 19th, both the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News announced Annie's arrest. There had been a short preliminary hearing in early August. On September 9th, she went on trial for the murder of Girl Christopher, a female child 1 day of age. Behind Girl Christopher were 7 other counts of first-degree murder. The article noted that some of Annie's alleged victims had even lived long enough to be given real names. Interspersed among the accounts of the trial were letters to the editor, printed in the Denver and Boulder newspapers. Paul understood that Annie had been driven to cull only the most hostile ones, those which reinforced her jaundiced view of mankind as homo bratus, but they were vituperative by any standards. There seemed to be a consensus. Hanging was too good for Annie Wilkes. One correspondent dubbed her the Dragon Lady, and the name stuck for the duration of the trial. Most seemed to feel that the Dragon Lady should be jabbed to death with hot forks, and most indicated they would be very willing to serve as a jabber. Beside one such letter, Annie had written in a shaky and somehow pathetic script entirely unlike her usual firm hand, "Sticks, stones will break my bones, words will never hurt me." It was apparent that Annie's biggest mistake had been not stopping when people finally realized something was going on. It was bad, but unfortunately, not quite bad enough. The idol only tottered. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial. and in places thin enough to read a newspaper through. The district attorney had a hand mark on girl Christopher's face and throat, which corresponded to the size of Annie's hand, complete with the mark of the amethyst ring she wore on the fourth finger of her right hand. The DA also had a pattern of absurd entries and exits to the nursery, which roughly corresponded to the infant deaths. But Annie was the head maternity nurse, after all, so she was always going in and out. Defense was able to show dozens of other occasions when Annie had entered the ward and nothing untoward had happened. Paul thought this was akin to proving that meteors never struck the earth by showing 5 days when not a single one had hit Farmer John's North Field, but he could understand the weight the argument would have carried with the jury that just the same. The prosecution wove its net as it could, but the handprint with the mark of the ring was really the most damning bit of evidence it could come up with. The fact that the state of Colorado had elected to bring Annie to trial at all, given such a slight chance of conviction on the evidence, left Paul with one assumption and one certainty. The assumption was that Annie had said things during her original interrogation which were extremely suggestive, perhaps even damning. Her attorney had managed to keep the transcript of that interrogation out of the trial record. The certainty was that Annie's decision to testify on her own behalf at the preliminary hearing had been extremely unwise. That testimony her attorney hadn't been able to keep out of the trial, although he had nearly ruptured himself trying. And while Annie had never confessed to anything in so many words during the 3 days in August she had spent up there on the stand in Denver, he thought that she had really confessed to everything. Excerpts from the clippings pasted in her book contained some real gems. Gateway drug to listening to true crime podcasts. Either that or you're going to develop an addiction to me reading you to bed, Tyler. Mayhaps next year we can pick a day of the week where I just read a book to you guys. And if I end up being able to get on disability, we might even be able to set it up where I just read through an entire book. I have to pick one shorter than this one, though. Perfect. Yeah. Did they make me feel sad? Of course they made me feel sad, considering the world we live in. I have nothing to be ashamed of. I am never ashamed. What I do, that's final. I never look back on that type of thing. Did I attend the funerals of any of them? Of course not. I find funerals very grim and depressing. Also, I don't believe babies are ensouled. No, I never cried. Was I sorry? I guess that's a philosophical question, isn't it? Of course I understand the question. I understand all your questions. I know you're all out to get me. If she had insisted on testifying in her own behalf at her trial, Paul thought, her lawyer probably would have shot her to shut her up. The case went to the jury on December 13th, 1982, and here was a startling picture from the Rocky Mountain News, a photo of Annie sitting calmly in her holding cell, reading Misery's Quest. In misery, the caption below asked, not the Dragon Lady. Annie reads calmly as she waits for the verdict. And then, on December 16th, banner headlines, Dragon Lady Innocent. In the body of the story, a juror who asked not to be identified was quoted, I had very grave doubts as to her innocence. Yes, unfortunately, I had very reasonable doubts as to her guilt. I hoped she would be tried again on one of the other counts. Perhaps the prosecution could make a stronger case on one of those. They all knew she did it, but nobody could prove it, so she slipped through their fingers. The case wound down over the next 3 or 4 pages. The DA said Annie surely would be tried on one of the other counts. 3 weeks later, he said he never said that. In early February of 1983, the district attorney's office issued a statement saying that while the cases of infanticide at the Boulder Hospital were still very much alive, the case against Annie Wilkes was closed. Slipped through their fingers. Her husband never testified for either side. Why was that, I wonder? There were more pages in the book, but he could tell by the snug way most lay against each other that he was almost done with Annie's history up to now. Thank God. The next page was from the Sidewinder Gazette, November 19th, 1984. Hikers had found the mutilated and partly dismembered remains of a young man in the early section of Girder Wildlife Preserve. The following week's paper identified him as Andrew Pomeroy, age 23, Coldstream Harbor, New York. Pomeroy had left New York for LA in September of the previous year hitchhiking. His parents had last heard from him on October 15th. He had called them collect from Julesburg. The body had been found in a dry stream bed. Police theorized that Pomeroy might actually have been killed near Highway 9 and washed into the wildlife preserve during the spring runoff. The coroner's report said the wounds had been inflicted with an axe. Paul wondered, not quite idly, how far Girder Wildlife Preserve was from here. He turned the page and looked at the last clipping, at least so far, and suddenly his breath was gone. It was as if, after wading grimly through the almost unbearable necrology of the foregoing pages, he had come face to face with his own obituary. It wasn't quite, but close enough for government work, he said in a low, hoarse voice. It was from Newsweek, the Transitions column, listed below the divorce of a TV actress and above the death of a Midwestern steel potentate was this item. Reported missing, Paul Sheldon, 42, novelist best known for his series of romances about sexy, bubble-headed, unsinkable Misery Chastain by his agent, Bryce Bell. I think he's fine, Bell said, but I wish he'd get in touch and ease my mind, and his ex-wives wish he'd get in touch and ease their bank accounts. Sheldon was last seen 7 weeks ago in Boulder, Colorado, where he had gone to finish a new novel. The clipping was 2 weeks old. Reported missing. That's all, just reported missing. I'm not dead. It's not like being dead. But it was like being dead, and suddenly he needed his medication because it wasn't just his legs that hurt. Everything hurt. He put the book carefully back in its place and began rolling the wheelchair toward the guest room. Outside, the wind gusted more strongly than it had yet done, slapping cold rain against the house, and Paul shrank away from it, moaning and afraid, trying desperately hard to hold himself together and not burst into tears. "19. An hour later, full of dope and drifting off to sleep, the sound of the howling wind now soothing rather than frightening, he thought. I'm not going to escape. No way. What is it Thomas Hardy says in Jude the Obscure? Someone could have come along and eased the boy's terror, but nobody did. Because nobody does. Right. Correct. Your ship is not going to come in because there are no boats for nobody. The Lone Ranger is busy making breakfast cereal commercials, and Superman's making movies in Tinseltown. You're on your own, Polly. Dead flat on your own. But maybe that's okay, because maybe you know what the answer is after all, don't you? Yes, of course he did. If he meant to get out of this, he would have to kill her. Yes, that's the answer. The only one there is, I think. So it's that same old game again, isn't it, Polly? Can you? He answered with no hesitation at all. Yes, I can. His eyes drifted closed. He slept. The storm continued through the next day. The following night, the clouds unraveled and blew away. At the same time, the temperature plummeted from 60 degrees down to 25. All the world outside froze solid. Sitting by the bedroom window and looking out at the ice-glittery morning world on that second full day alone, Paul could hear Misery the pig squealing in the barn and one of the cows bellowing. He often heard the animals. They were as much part of the general background as the chiming parlor clock. But he had never heard the pig squeal so. He thought he had heard the cow bellow like that once before, but it had been an evil sound dimly heard in an evil dream, because then he had been full of his own pain. It had been when Annie had gone away the first time, leaving him with no pills. He had been raised in suburban Boston and had lived most of his life in New York City. But he thought he knew what those pained cow bellows meant. One of the cows needed to be milked. The other apparently didn't, possibly because Annie's erratic milking habits had already dried her up. And the pig? Hungry. That was all. And that was enough. They weren't going to get any relief today. He doubted if Annie would be able to make it back even if she had wanted to. This part of the world had turned into one big skating rink. He was a little surprised at the depth of sympathy he felt for the animals and the depth of his anger at Annie for how she had, in her unadmitting and arrogant egoism, left them to suffer in their pens. If your animals could talk, Annie, they would tell you who the real dirty birdie was around here. He himself was quite comfortable as those days passed. He ate from cans, drank water from the new pitcher, and took his medication regularly, napped each afternoon. The tale of misery and her amnesia and her previously unsuspected and spectacularly rotten bloodkin marched steadily along toward Africa, which was to be the setting of this novel's second half. The irony was that the woman had coerced him into writing what was easily the best of the misery novels. Ian and Geoffrey were off in Southampton outfitting a schooner called the Lorelei for the run. It was on the dark continent that Misery, who kept slipping into cataleptic trances at the most inconvenient moments, and, of course, if she were to be stung by another bee, ever in her entire life, she would die almost instantly, would either be killed or cured. For 150 miles inland from Lawston, a tiny British-Dutch settlement on the northernmost tip of the Barbary Coast's dangerous crescent, lived Burkas, Africa's most dangerous natives. The Burkas were sometimes known as the Bee People. Few of the whites who dared to venture into Burkas country had ever returned, but those who did had brought back fabulous tales of a woman's face jutting from the side of a tall, crumbling mesa, a merciless face with a gaping mouth and a huge ruby set in her stone forehead. There was another story, only rumor, surely, but strangely persistent, that within the caves which honeycombed the stone behind the idol's jeweled forehead, there lived a hive of giant albino bees, swarming protectively around their queen, a jelly-like monstrosity of infinite poison and infinite magic. During the days, he diverted himself with this pleasant foolishness. In the evenings, he sat quietly, listening to the pig squeal and thinking about how he would kill the dragon lady. Playing Can You in real life was quite different from playing it in a cross-legged circle as a kid or doing it in front of a typewriter as a grown-up, he discovered. When it was just a game, and even if they gave you money for it, a game was still all it was. You could think of some pretty wild things and make them seem believable. The connection between Misery Chastain and Miss Charlotte Evelyn Hyde, for instance. They had turned out to be half-sisters. Misery would later discover her father down there in Africa, hanging out with the Burka Bee People. In real life, however, the arcane had a way of losing its power. Not that Paul didn't try. There were all those drugs in the downstairs bathroom. Surely there was some way he could use them to put her out of the way, wasn't there? Or at least render her helpless long enough that he could do it? Take Novril. Enough of that shit, and he wouldn't even have to put her out of the way. She would just float off on her own. That's a very good idea, Paul. I tell you what to do. Just get a whole bunch of those capsules and stick them all through the pint of her ice cream. She'll just think they're pistachio nuts and gobble them right down. No, of course that wouldn't work. Nor could he pull a cutie like opening the capsules and mixing the powder into some pre-softened ice cream. Novril in the raw was fabulously bitter. He had tasted it and knew. It was a taste she would recognize at once in the midst of the expected sweetness. And then woe is you, Polly. Woe to the max. In a story, it would have been a pretty good idea. In real life, however, it simply did not make it. He wasn't sure he would have taken the chance even if the white powder inside the capsules had been almost or completely tasteless. It wasn't safe enough. It wasn't sure enough. This was no game. It was his life. Other ideas passed through his mind and were rejected even more quickly. One was suspending something, the typewriter came immediately to mind, over the door so she would be killed or knocked unconscious when she came in. Another was running a tripwire across the stairs, but the problem in both cases was the same as the Novril in the ice cream trick. Neither was sure enough. He found himself literally unable to think of what might happen to him if he tried to assassinate her and failed. As dark came down on that second night, Misery's squealing went on as monotonously as ever. The pig sounded like the unlatched door with rusty hinges squealing in the wind. Bossy number 1 abruptly fell silent. Paul wondered uneasily if perhaps the poor animal's udder had burst, resulting in death by exsanguination. For a moment, his imagination, so vivid, tried to present him with a picture of the cow lying dead in a puddle of mixed milk and blood, and he quickly willed it away. He told himself not to be such a numbnuts. Cows didn't die that way, but the voice doing the telling lacked conviction. He had no idea if they did or not, and besides, it wasn't the cow that was his problem, was it? All your fancy ideas come down to one thing. You want to kill her by remote control. You don't want her blood on your hands. You're like a man who loves nothing better than a thick steak, but wouldn't last an hour in a slaughterhouse. But listen, Polly, and get it straight. You must face reality at this point in your life, if at no other. Nothing fancy. No curlicues, right? Right. He rolled back into the kitchen and opened drawers until he found the knives. He selected the longest butcher knife and went back to his room, pausing to rub away the hub marks on the sides of the doorway. The signs of his passage were nevertheless becoming clearer. Doesn't matter. If she misses them one more time, she misses them for good. He put the knife on the night table, hoisted himself into the bed, then slid it under the mattress. When Annie came back, he was going to ask her for a nice cold glass of water, and when she leaned over to give it to him, he was going to plunge the knife into her throat. Nothing fancy. Paul closed his eyes, and he dropped off to sleep. When the Cherokee came whispering back into the driveway that morning at 4 o'clock with both its engine and its lights off, he did not stir until he felt the sting of Hypo sliding into his arm and woke up to see her face leaning over his. He hadn't the slightest idea she was back. "21. At first he thought he was dreaming about his own book, that the dark was the dream dark of the caves behind the huge stone head of the Burka bee goddess, and the sting was that of a bee. Paul? He muttered something that meant nothing, something that meant only, get out of here, dream voice, get gone. Paul. That was no dream voice. It was Annie's voice. He forced his eyes open. Yes, it was her, and for a moment his panic grew even stronger. Then it simply seeped away like fluid running down a partly clogged drain. What the hell? He was totally disoriented. She was standing there in the shadows as if she had never been away, wearing one of her woolly skirts and frumpy sweaters. He saw the needle in her hand and understood it hadn't been a sting, but an injection. What the fuck? Either way it was the same thing. He had been gotten by the goddess. But what had she... That bright panic tried to come again, and once again it hit a dead circuit. All he could feel was a kind of academic surprise. That and some intellectual curiosity about where she had come from, and why now. He tried to lift his hands, and they came up a little, but only a little. It felt as if there were invisible weights dangling from them. They dropped back into the sheet with little dull thumps. Doesn't matter what she shot me up with. It's like what you write on the last page of a book. It's the end. The thought brought no fear. Instead, he felt a kind of calm euphoria. At least she's tried to make it kind. Make it... Ah, there you are, Annie said, and added with lumbering wettishness. I see you, Paul. Those blue eyes. Did I ever tell you what lovely blue eyes you have? But I suppose other women have. Women who are much prettier than I am, and much bolder about their affections as well. Came creeping in the night, killed me. Hypo or beasting, no difference. And so much for the knife under the bed. All I am now is the latest number in Annie's considerable body count. And then, as the numbing euphoria of the injection began to spread, he thought almost with Huser, the lousy Shazarad I turned out to be. He thought that in that moment sleep would return, a more final sleep, but it did not. He saw her slip the hypo into the pocket of her skirt, and then she sat down on the bed. Oh, Jesus. Hi, Link. Thank you for self-care. That scared me. She sat down on the bed. Not where she usually sat, however. She sat on its foot, and for a moment, he saw only her solid, impervious back as she bent over as if to check on something. He heard a wooden thunk, a metallic clunk, and then a shaking sound he had heard someplace before. After a moment, he placed it. Take the matches, Paul. Diamond blue tips. He didn't know what else she might have there at the foot of the bed, but one of them was a box of diamond blue-tip matches. Annie turned to him and smiled again. Whatever else might have happened, her apocalyptic depression had passed. She brushed an errant lock of her hair back behind her ear with a girlish gesture. It went oddly with the lock's dull, dirty half-shine. Dull, dirty half-shine. Oh boy, you gotta remember that one. That one ain't half bad. Oh boy, I am stoned now. All the past was prologue to this shit. Hey baby, this here is the main line. Oh fuck, I'm fucked. This is crystal top end shit. This is going out on a mile-high wave and a fucking rolls. This is... What do you want first, Paul? The good news or the bad news? Good news first. He managed a big, foolish grin. Guess the bad news is that this is the end, huh? Guess you didn't like books so great, huh? Too bad. I tried. It was even working. I was starting to drive on it. She looked at him reproachfully. I love the book, Paul. I told you that. I never lie. I love it so much I don't want to read any more until the very end. I'm sorry to have made you fill in the ends yourself, but it's like peeking. His big foolish grin stretched even wider. He thought soon it would meet in the back. Tired lover's not there, and most of his poor old being would just topple off. Maybe it would land in the bedpan beside the bed. In some deep, dim part of his mind where the dope hadn't yet reached, alarm bells were going off. She loved the book, which meant she didn't mean to kill him. Whatever was going on, she didn't mean to kill him. And unless his assessment of Annie Wilkes was totally off the beam, that meant she had something even worse in store. Now that the light in the room did not look dull, it looked marvelously pure, marvelously full of its own gray and eldritch charm. He could imagine cranes half glimpsed in gunmetal mist standing in one-legged silence beside upland lakes in that light. Could imagine the mica flecks in rocks jutting down from spring grasses and upland meadows shining in the shaggy glow of glazed window glass. In that light, he could imagine elves shucking their busy selves off to work in lines under the dew-soaked leaves of early ivy in the light. Oh boy, you are stoned, Paul thought, and giggled faintly. Annie smiled in return. The good news, she said, is that your car is gone. I've been very worried about your car, Paul. I knew it would take a storm like this to get rid of it. Maybe even that wouldn't do the trick. The spring runoff got rid of that Pomeroy dirty bird. But a car is ever so much heavier than a man, isn't it? Even a man as full of cockadoodie as he was. But the storm and the runoff combined was enough to do the trick. Your car is gone. That's the good news. What? More faint alarm bells. Pomeroy. He knew that name, but he couldn't think exactly how he knew it. Then it came to him. Pomeroy. The late, great Andrew Pomeroy, 23 of Coldstream Harbor, New York, found in the Girder Wildlife Preserve, wherever that was. Nah, she drugged him with something fierce, Tyler. My water bottle is empty. I need a drink. I will be right back. I'm so sorry to stop us there. I'll be back in a minute. It should not be long. I will leave the music playing and this screen up. Un moment. I was about to address your car comment. His car was in a ditch, wrecked, under a lot of snow. So she didn't get rid of it, the weather did. And also it was probably totaled, so, you know. There's that. Yeah, you missed the beginning part where the reason he's in this predicament is because he crashed. She found him and promptly locked him up. Because his legs are like completely shattered. Which is why he is currently hooked on pain meds. Yeah, so. Just so you know. Oh my gosh. I just had a bunch of water. What's going on? Now, Paul, she said in a prim voice he knew so well. No need to be coy. I know you know who Andy Pomeroy was, because I know you've read my book. I suppose that I sort of hoped you would read it, you know, Otherwise, why would I have left it out? But I made sure, I made sure of everything. And sure enough, the threads were broken. The threads, he said faintly. Oh, yes. I read once about a way you're supposed to find out, for sure, if someone has been snooping around in your drawers. You tape a very fine thread across each one, and if you come back and find one broken, why, don't you? You know someone's been snooping. You see how easy it is? Yes, Annie. He was listening, but what he really wanted to do was trip out on the marvelous quality of the light. Oh my gosh. Again, she bent over to check whatever it was she had at the foot of the bed. Again, he heard a faint, dull clunk, clank. Wood thumping against some metallic object, and then she turned back, brushing absently at her hair again. I did that with my book. Only I didn't really use threads, I used hairs from my own head. I put them across the thickness of the book in 3 different places, and when I came in this morning, very early, creeping like a little mouse so I wouldn't wake you up, all 3 threads were broken, so I knew you had been looking at my book. She paused and smiled. It was for Annie a very winning smile, yet it had an unpleasant quality he could not quite put his finger on. Not that I was surprised. I knew you had been out of the room. That's the bad news. I've known for a long, long time, Paul. He should feel angry and dismayed, he supposed. She had known almost from the start, it seemed. But he could only feel that dreamy, floating euphoria. And what she was saying did not seem nearly as important as the glorious quality of the strengthening light as the day hovered on the edge of becoming. But, she said with the air of one returning to business, we were talking about your car. I have studded tires, Paul, and at my place in the hills, I keep a set of 10X tire chains. Early yesterday afternoon, I felt ever so much better. I spent most of my time up there on my knees, deep in prayer, and the answer came, as it often does, and it was quite simple, as it often is. What you take to the Lord in prayer, Paul, he giveth back 1,000-fold. So I put the chains on, and I crept back down here. It was not easy. I knew I might well have an accident in spite of the studs and the chains. I also knew that there is rarely such a thing as a minor accident on those twisty up-country roads. But I felt easy in my mind because I felt safe in the will of the Lord. That's very uplifting, Annie, Paul croaked. She gave him a look which was momentarily startled and narrowly suspicious, and then she relaxed and smiled. I've got a present for you, Paul, she said softly, but before he could ask her what it was, he wasn't sure he wanted any sort of present from Annie. She went on. The roads were terribly icy. I almost went off twice. The second time, old Bessie slid all the way around in a circle and kept right on going downhill while she did. Annie laughed cheerily, and then I got stuck in a snowbank. This was around midnight, but a sanding crew from the Eustis Public Works Department came along and helped me out. Bully for the Eustis Public Works Department, Paul said. But what came out was badly slurred. Bully for the Eustis Public Works Department. The 2 miles from the country highway, that was the last hard patch. The country highway is Route 9, The road you were on when you had your wreck, they had sanded that one to a fare thee well. I stopped where you went off and looked for your car, and I knew what I would have to do if I saw it. Because there would be questions, and I'd be just about the first one they'd ask those questions to, for reasons I think you know. I'm way ahead of you, Annie, he thought, and I examined this whole scenario 3 weeks ago. One of the reasons I brought you back was because it seemed like more than a coincidence. It seemed like the hand of Providence. What seemed like the hand of Providence, Annie? He managed. Your car was wrecked in almost exactly the same spot where I got rid of that Pomeroy creep, the one who said he was an artist. She flapped the hand in contempt, shifting her feet, and there was that wooden clunking sound as if one of them brushed some whatever it was that she had down there on the floor. I picked him up on my way back from Estes Park. I was there at a ceramics show. I like little ceramic figurines. I noticed. Paul said. His voice seemed to come from light years away. Captain Turk, there's a voice coming in over the sub-etheric, he thought, and chuckled dimly. That deep part of him, the part the dope couldn't reach, tried to warn him to shut his mouth. Just shut it. But what was this? What was the sense? She knew. Of course she knows. The Birka bee goddess knows everything. I particularly liked the penguin on the block of ice. Thank you, Paul. He is cute, isn't he? Pomeroy was hitchhiking. He had a pack on his back. He said he was an artist, although I found out later he was nothing but a hippie dope fiend dirty bird who had been washing dishes in an Estes Park restaurant for the last couple of months. When I told him I had a place in Sidewinder, he said that was a real coincidence. He said he was going to Sidewinder. He said he'd gotten an assignment from a magazine in New York, and he was going up to the old hotel and sketch the ruins. His pictures were going to be with an article they were doing. It was a famous old hotel called the Overlook. It burned down 10 years ago. The caretaker burned it down. He was crazy. Everybody in town said so. But never mind, he's dead. I let Pomeroy stay here with me. We were lovers. She looked at him with her black eyes burning in her solid yet doughy white face, and Paul thought, if Andrew Pomeroy could get it up for you, Annie, he must have been as crazy as the caretaker that burned down the hotel. Then I found out that he didn't really have an assignment to draw pictures of the hotel at all. He was just doing them in his own, hoping to sell them. He wasn't even sure the magazine was doing an article on the Overlook. I found that out pretty quick. After I did, I sneaked a look at his sketchpad. I felt I had a perfect right to do that. After all, he was eating my food and sleeping in my bed. There were only 8 or 9 pictures in the whole book, and they were terrible. Her face wrinkled, and for a moment she looked like she had imitated the sound the pig made. I could have made better pictures. He came in while I was looking, and he got mad. He said I was snooping. I said I didn't call licking things in my own house snooping. I said if he was an artist, I was Madame Curie. He started to laugh. He laughed at me, so You killed him, Paul said. His voice sounded dim and ancient. She smiled uneasily at the wall. Well, I guess it was something like that. I don't remember very well. Just when he was dead. I remember that. I remember giving him a bath. He stared at her and felt a sick, soupy horror. The image came to him. Pomeroy's naked body floating in the downstairs tub like a piece of raw dough. Head reclining aslant against the porcelain, eyes open staring up at the ceiling. I had to, she said, lips drawing back a bit from her teeth. You probably don't know what the police can do with just one piece of thread or dirt under someone's fingernails, or even dust in a corpse's hair. You don't know, but I worked in hospitals all my life, and I do know. I know about forensics. She was working herself into one of her patented Annie Wilkes frenzies, and he knew he should try and say something which would at least temporarily diffuse her, but his mouth seemed dumb and useless. They're out to get me, all of them. Do you think they would have listened if I tried to tell them how it was? Do you? Oh, no. They'd probably say something crazy, like I made a pass at him and he laughed at me and so I killed him. They'd probably say something like that. And you know what, Annie? You know what? I think that just might be closer to the truth. The dirty birdies around here would say anything to get me in trouble or to smear my name. Hello, cat. Thank you for bapping my knee. Can I help you? You just very much want attention. Okay. She paused, not quite panting, but breathing hard, looking at him hard, as if inviting him to just dare and tell her different. Just you dare. Then she seemed to get herself under some kind of control, and she went on in a calmer voice. I washed, well, what was left of him, and his clothes. I knew what to do. It was snowing outside, the first real snow of the year, and they said we'd have a foot by the next morning. I put his clothes in a plastic bag and wrapped the body in sheets and took everything out that dry wash on Route 9 after dark. I walked about a mile farther down from where your car ended up. I walked until I was in the woods and just dumped everything. You probably think I hid him, but I didn't. I knew the snow would cover him up, and I thought the spring melt would carry him away if I left him in the stream bed. And that was what happened. Except I had no idea he would go so far. Why, they found his body a whole year after he died, and almost 27 miles away. Actually, it would have been better if he hadn't gone as far as he did, because there are always hikers and bird watchers in the Girder Preserve. The woods around here are much less traveled. She smiled. And that's where your car is now, Paul. Somewhere between Route 9 and the Girder Wildlife Preserve. Somewhere in the woods. It's far enough in so you can't see it from the road. I've got a spotlight on the side of old Bessie, and it's plenty powerful. But the wash is empty all the way into the woods. I guess I'll go on foot and check when the water goes down a little, but I'm almost positive it's safe. Some hunter will find it in 2 years or 5 years or 7 years, all rusty and with chipmunks nesting in the seeds. And by then, you will have finished my book and we'll be back in New York or Los Angeles or wherever it is you decide to go, and I'll be living my quiet life out here. Maybe we will correspond sometimes. She smiled mistily. The smile of a woman who sees a lovely castle in the sky. And then the smile disappeared, and she was all business again. So I came back here, and on the way I did some hard thinking. I had to, because your car being gone meant that you could really stay. You could really finish my book. I wasn't sure you'd be able to, you know, although I never said because I didn't want to upset you. Partly I didn't want to upset you because I knew you wouldn't write as well if I did. That sounds ever so much colder than I really felt, my dear. You see, I began loving only the part of you that makes such wonderful stories, because that's the only part I had. Oh. Ah. Ow. Forgot to open my Kleenex box. I forgot I had to get a new one, and used the last one earlier, and did not open the new one. I'm so smart, guys. Oh my goodness. Okay. Ugh. Sneezing is so unfun, especially when it hurts. You see, I began loving only the part of you that makes such wonderful stories, because that's the only part I had. The rest of you I didn't know anything about. And I thought that part might really be quite unpleasant. I'm not a dummy, you know. I've read about some so-called famous authors, and I know that they often are quite unpleasant. Why, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and that redneck fellow from Mississippi, Faulkner or whatever it was. Those fellows may have won National Pulitzer Book Awards and things, but they were nothing but cock-a-doodle drunken bums just the same. Other ones, too. When they weren't writing wonderful stories, they were drinking and whoring and shooting dope and heaven knows what else. But you're not like that, and after a while I came to know the rest of Paul Sheldon, and I hope you don't mind me saying it, but I have come to love the rest of him too. Thank you, Annie, he said from atop his golden, glistening wave, and he thought, but you may have read me wrong, you know. I mean, Situations that lead men into temptation have been severely curtailed up here. It's sort of hard to go bar hopping when you've got a couple of broken legs, Annie. As for shooting dope, I've got the Burka Bee goddess to do that for me. But would you want to stay? She resumed. That was the question I had to ask myself. And as much as I may have wanted to pull the wool over my eyes, I knew the answer to that. I knew even before I saw the marks on the door over there. She pointed, and Paul thought, I'll bet she did know almost from the very first. Wool pulling? Not you, Annie. Never you. But I was doing enough of that for both of us. Do you remember the first time I went away, after we had that silly fight over the paper? Yes, Annie. That was when you went out the first time, wasn't it? Yes. There was no point in denying it. Of course, you wanted your pills. I should have known you'd do anything to get your pills. But when I get mad, I get... you know. She giggled a little nervously. Paul did not join her, or even smile. The memory of that pain-racked, endless interlude with the phantom voice of the sportscaster doing the play-by-play was still too strong. Yes, I know how you get, he thought. You get oogie. At first, I wasn't completely sure. Oh, I saw some of the figures on the table at the parlor had been moved around, but I thought I might have done that myself. I have times when I'm really quite forgetful. It crossed my mind that you'd been out of your room, but then I thought, no, that's impossible. He's so badly hurt. Besides, I locked the door. I even checked to make sure the key was still in my skirt pocket, and it was. Then I remembered you were in your chair, so maybe... One of the things you learn when you've been an RN for 10 years is that it's always wise to check your maybes. So I took a look at the things I kept in the downstairs bathroom. Mostly samples I brought home off and on while I was working. You should see all the stuff that just goes rolling around in hospitals, Paul. And every now and then I help myself to a few extras, and I wasn't the only one. But I know enough not to take any of the morphine-based drugs. They lock those up. They count. They keep records. And if they get an idea that a nurse is, chipping, that's what they call it. They watch that nurse until they're sure, then bang. And he chopped her hand down hard. Out they go, and most of them never put on the white cap again. I was smarter than that. Looking at those cartons was the same as looking at the figurines on the little parlor table. I thought the stuff in them had been sort of stirred around, and I was pretty sure that one of the cartons that was on the bottom before was on top of some of the other cartons now, but I couldn't be sure. I could have done it myself when I was preoccupied. Then, 2 days later, after I had just about decided to let it go, I came in to give you your afternoon medication. You were still having your nap. I tried to turn the doorknob, but for a few seconds it wouldn't turn. It was like the door was locked. Then it did turn, and I heard something rattle inside the lock. Then you started to stir around, so I just gave you your pills like always, like I didn't suspect. I'm very good at that, Paul. Then I helped you into your chair so you could write, and when I helped you into it that afternoon, I felt like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. My eyes were opened. I saw how much of your color had come back. I saw that you were moving your legs. They were giving you pain, and you could only move them a little, but you were moving them, and your arms were getting stronger again as well. I saw that you were almost healthy again. That was when I started to realize I could have a problem with you, even if no one from the outside suspected a thing. I looked at you, and I saw that I might not be the only one good at keeping secrets. That night, I changed your medication for something a little stronger, and when I was sure you weren't going to wake up, even if someone exploded a grenade under your bed, I got my little toolkit from the cellar shelf, and I took the key blade off that door. And look what I found! She took something small and dark from one of the flat pockets of her mannish skirt. She put it in his numb hand. He brought it up close to his face and stared at it owlishly. It was a bent and twisted chunk of a bobby pin. Paul began to giggle. He couldn't help it. What's so funny, Paul? The day you went to pay your taxes, I needed to open the door again. The wheelchair, it was almost too big. It left black marks. I wanted to wipe them off if I could. So I wouldn't see them. Yes. But you already had, hadn't you? After I found one of my bobby pins in the lock, you bet your Rudy patooties I had. Paul nodded and laughed even harder. He was laughing so hard tears were squirting from his eyes. All his work, all his worry, all for nothing. It seemed deliciously funny. he said. I was worried that piece of bobby pin might mess me up, but it didn't. I never even heard it rattling around. And there was a good reason for that, wasn't there? It never rattled because you took it out. What a fooler you are, Annie. Yes, he said, smiling thinly. What a fooler I am. She moved her feet. That muffled wooden thump from the foot of the bed came again. 22. How many times were you out in all? The knife. Oh, Christ, the knife. Twice. No, wait. I went out again yesterday afternoon around 5 o'clock to fill up my water pitcher. This was true. He had filled the pitcher, but he had omitted the real reason for his third trip. The real reason was under his mattress. The princess and the pea, Polly and the pig sticker. 3 times, counting the trip for water. Tell the truth, Paul. Just 3 times, I swear, and never to get away. For Christ's sake, I'm writing a book here, in case you didn't notice. Don't use the Savior's name in vain, Paul. You quit using mine that way, and maybe I will. The first time I was in so much pain that it felt like someone had put me into hell from the knees on down. And someone did. You did, Annie. Shut up, Paul. The second time I just wanted to get something to eat and make sure I had some extra supplies here in case you were gone for a long time. He went on, ignoring her. Then I got thirsty. That's all there is. No big conspiracy. You didn't try the telephone either time, I suppose, or look at the locks? Because you're just such a good little boy. Sure, I tried the phone. Sure, I looked at the locks. Not that I would have gotten very far in the mud bath out there, even if your doors had been wide open. The dope was coming in heavier and heavier waves, and now he just wished she would shut up and go away. She had already doped him enough to tell the truth. He was afraid he would have to pay the consequences in time. But first, he wanted to sleep. How many times did you go out? I told you. How many times? Her voice was rising. Tell the truth. I am. 3 times. How many times, goddammit? In spite of the cruiser load of dope she'd shot into him, Paul began to be frightened. At least if she does something to me, it can't hurt too much. And she wants me to finish the book. She said so. You're treating me like a fool. You noticed how shiny her skin was. Like some sort of polymer plastic stretched tightly over stone. There seemed to be no pores at all in that face. Annie, I swear. Oh, liars can swear. Liars love to swear. Go ahead and treat me like a fool if that's what you want. That's fine. Goody goody for you. Treat a woman who isn't a fool as if she were. And that woman always comes out ahead. Let me tell you, Paul. I stretched thread and strands from my head all over this house, and I found many of them snapped later on. Snapped or entirely gone. Just disappeared. Poof. Not just on my scrapbook, but in this hallway, across my dresser drawers, upstairs, in the shed, all over. Annie, how could I possibly get out in the shed with all those locks on the kitchen door? He wanted to ask, but she gave him no time, only plunged on. Now you go right ahead and keep telling me it was only 3 times, Mr. Smart Guy, but I'll tell you who the fool is. He stared at her, groggy but appalled. He didn't know how to answer her. It was so paranoid, so crazy. My God, he thought, suddenly forgetting the shed. Upstairs? Did she say upstairs? Annie, how in God's name could I get upstairs? Oh, right, she cried, her voice cracking. Oh, sure, I came in here a few days ago and you'd managed to get into your wheelchair all by yourself. You could do that, you could get upstairs, you could crawl. Yes, on my broken legs and my shattered knee, he said. Again, that black look of crevasse, the batty darkness under the meadow. Annie Wilkes was gone. The Burka Bee goddess was here. You don't want to be smart to me, Paul, she whispered. Well, Annie, one of us has to at least try. And you're not doing a very good job. If you just try to see how many times? 3. The first time to get medication. Yes, Novril capsules. And the second time to get food. That's right. Third time was to fill up the pitcher. Yes, Annie, I'm so dizzy. You filled it in the bathroom of the hall. Yes. Once for medication, once for food, and once for water. Yes, I told you. He tried to yell, but what came out was a strengthless croak. She reached into her skirt pocket and brought out the butcher knife. Its keen blade glimmered in the brightening morning light. She suddenly twisted to the left and threw the knife. She threw it with deadly, half-casual grace of a carnival performer. It struck, quivering in the plaster below the picture of the Arc de Triomphe. I investigated under your mattress a little before I gave you your pre-op shot. I expected to find capsules. The knife was a complete surprise. I almost cut myself. But you didn't put it there, did you? He didn't reply. His mind was spinning and diving like an out-of-control amusement park ride. Pre-op shot? Was that what she had said? Pre-op? He was suddenly, utterly sure that she meant to pull the knife from the wall and castrate him with it. No, you didn't put it there. You went out once for medication, once for food, and once for water. The knife must have floated in here and slid under there all by itself. Yes, that's what must have happened. Annie shrieked derisive laughter. Pre-op? Dear God, is that what she said? Damn you, she cried. God damn you, how many times? All right. I got the knife when I went after the water. I confess. If you think that means I was out any number of times, go on and fill in the blank. If you wanted to be 5 times, it was 5. If you wanted to be 20 or 50 or 100, that's what it was. I'll admit it. However many times you think, Eddie, that's how many times I went out. For a moment, in his anger and dopey befuddlement, he had lost sight of the hazy, frightening concept inherent in that phrase, pre-op shot. He wanted to tell her so much, wanted to tell her even though he knew that a ravening paranoid like Annie would reject what was so obvious. It had been damp. Scotch tape did not like the damp. In many cases, her Ludlamesque little traps had undoubtedly just peeled off and floated away in some random draft. And the rats, with a lot of water in the cellar and the mistress of the manor gone, he had heard them in the walls. Of course, they had run of the house, and they would be attracted by all the oogie stuff Annie had left around. The rats were probably the gremlins who had broken most of Annie's threads, but she would only push such ideas away. In her mind, he was almost ready to run the New York Marathon. Annie, what did you mean when you said you gave me a pre-op shot? But Annie was still fixated on the other matter. I say it was 7, she said softly. At least 7. Was it 7? If you want it to be 7, it was 7. What did you mean when you said, I can see you mean to be stubborn, she said. I guess fellows like you must get so used to lying for a living that you just can't stop doing it in real life. That's all right, Paul, because the principle doesn't change if you were out 7 times or 70 or 70 times 7. The principle doesn't change, and neither does the response. He was floating away. He closed his eyes and heard her speak as if from a long distance away, like a supernatural voice from a cloud. Goddess, he thought. Have you ever read about the early days in the Kimberley diamond mines, Paul? I read a book on that one, he said for no reason at all, and laughed. Pre-op shot? Sometimes the native workers stole diamonds. They wrapped them in leaves and poked them up their rectums. If they got away from the big hole without being discovered, they would run. And do you know what the British did to them if they got caught before they could get over Oraniver and into Boer country? Killed them, I suppose, he said, eyes still closed. Oh, no. That would have been like junking an expensive car just because of a broken spring. If they caught them, they made sure that they could go on working, but they also made sure they would never run again. The operation was called hobbling, Paul. This is what I'm going to do to you. For my own safety and yours as well. Believe me, you need to be protected from yourself. Just remember, a little pain and it will be over. Try to hold that thought. Terror, sharp as a gust of wind filled with razor blades, blew through the dope, and Paul's eyes flew open. She had risen and now drew the bedclothes down, exposing his twisted legs and bare feet. No, he said, no. Annie, whatever it is you've got on your mind, we can talk about it, can't we? Please. She bent over. When she straightened up, she was holding the axe from the shed in one hand and a propane torch in the other. The blade of the axe gleamed. Written on the side of the propane torch was the word Burns-O-Matic. She bent down again, and this time came up with a dark bottle and the box of matches. There was a label on the dark bottle. Written on the label was the word betadine. He never forgot these things, these words, these names. Annie, no! He screamed. Annie, I'll stay right here. I won't even get out of bed. Please, oh God, please don't cut me. It'll be all right, she said. Her face now had that slack, unplugged look. That look of perplexed vacuity. And before his mind was completely consumed in a forest fire of panic, he understood that when this was over, he would only have the vaguest memories of what she had done. as she only had the vaguest memories of killing the children and the old people and the terminal patients and Andrew Pomeroy. After all, this was the woman who, although she'd gotten her cap in 1966, had told him only minutes ago that she had been a nurse for 10 years. She killed Pomeroy with that same axe. I know she did. He continued to shriek and plead, but his words had become inarticulate babble. He tried to turn away from her, and his legs cried out. He tried to draw them up and make them less vulnerable, less of a target, and his knee screamed. Only a minute more, Paul, she said, and uncapped the betadine. She poured a brownish-red muck over his left ankle. Only a minute more, and it's over. She tipped the blade of the axe flat, the tendons standing out in her strong right wrist, and he could see the wink of the amethyst ring she still wore on her pinky finger of that hand. She poured betadine on the blade. He could smell it. A doctor's office smell. That smell meant you were going to get a shot. Just a little pain, Paul. It won't be bad. She turned the axe over and splashed the other side of the blade. He could see random flowers of rust blooming on this side before the goop covered it. Annie, oh, Annie, please. Please don't, Annie, I swear to you. I'll be good, I swear, God. Oh, please be good. Just give me a kiss. Oh, God, Annie, please let me be good. Just a little pain, then this nasty business will be behind us for good, Paul. She tossed the open bottle of betadine over her shoulder, her face blank and empty, and yet so inarguably solid. She laid her right hand down the handle of the axe, almost to the steel head. She gripped the handle further up the left hand and spread her legs like a loner. Annie, oh, please, don't hurt me. Her eyes were mild and drifting. Don't worry, she said. I'm a trained nurse. The axe came whistling down and buried itself in Paul Sheldon's left leg just above the ankle. Pain exploded up his body in a gigantic bolt. Dark red blood splattered across her face like Indian war paint. It splattered the wall. He heard the blade squeal against the bone as she wrenched it free. He looked unbelievingly down at himself. The sheet was turning red. He saw his toes wriggling. Then he saw her raising the dripping axe again. Her hair had fallen free of its pins and hung around her blank face. He tried to pull back in spite of the pain in his leg and knee and realized that his leg was moving, but his foot wasn't. All he was doing was widening the axe slash, making it open like a mouth. He had time to realize his foot was now only held on his leg by the meat of his calf before the blade came down again, directly into the gash, shearing through the rest of his leg and burying itself deep in the mattress. Springs boinged and squoinged. Annie pulled the axe free and tossed it aside. She looked absently at the jetting stump for a moment and picked up the box of matches. She lit one. Then she picked up the propane torch with the word benzomatic on the side and twisted the valve on the side. The torch hissed. Blood poured from the place where he no longer was. Annie held the match delicately under the nozzle of the benzomatic. There was a floop sound. A long yellow flame appeared. Annie adjusted it to a hard blue line of fire. Can't suture, she said. No time. Tourniquet's no good. No central pressure point. Got to. Rinse. Cauterize. She bent. Paul screamed as fire splashed over the raw, bleeding stump. Smoke drifted up. It smelled sweet. He and his first wife had honeymooned on Maui. There had been a luau. The smell reminded him of the smell of the pig they had brought out of the pit where it had cooked all day. The pig had been on a stick, sagging, black, falling apart. The pain was screaming. He was screaming. Almost over, she said, and turned the valve, and now the ground sheet caught fire around the stump that was no longer bleeding. A stump that was as black as the pig's hide that it had been when they had brought it out of the luau pit. Eileen had turned away, but Paul had watched, fascinated as they pulled off the pig's crackling skin as easily as you might skim off a sweater after a football game. Almost over. She turned the torch off. His leg lay in a lie of flames with his old friend, the yellow floor bucket. She dumped it over the flames. He was screaming. The pain, the goddess, the pain. Oh, Africa. She stood looking at him, at the darkening, bloody sheet, with vague consternation. Her face was the face of a woman who hears on her radio that an earthquake has killed 10,000 people in Pakistan or Turkey. You'll be all right, Paul, she said, but her voice was suddenly frightened. Her eyes began to dart aimlessly around as they had when it seemed that the fire of his burning book might get out of control. Yeah, well, it's supposed to be a horror novel, hero. Then suddenly, fixed on something almost with relief, I'll just get rid of the trash. She picked up his foot. Its toes were still spasming. She carried it across the room. By the time she got to the door, they had stopped moving. He could see a scar on the instep and remembered how he had gotten that. How he had stepped on a piece of bottle when he was just a kid. Had that been at Revere Beach? Yes, he thought it had been. He remembered he had cried and his father had told him that it was just a little cut. His father told him to stop acting like someone had cut his goddamn foot off. Tyler. All right, Forgonier. Hello? Annie paused at the door and looked back at Paul, who shrieked and writhed in the charred and blood-soaked bed, his face a deathly fading white. Now you're hobbled, she said, and don't blame me. It's your own fault. She went out. So did Paul. 23. The cloud was back. Paul dived for it, not caring if the cloud meant death instead of unconsciousness this time. He almost hoped it did. Just no pain, please. No memories, no pain, no horror, no Annie Wilkes. He dived for the cloud, dived into the cloud, dimly hearing the sound of his own shrieks and smelling his own cooked meat. And his thoughts faded as he thought, Goddess, kill you, Goddess, kill you, Goddess. Then there was nothing but nothing. Part 3. Nearing the end game now. Paul. It's no good. I've been trying to sleep for the last half hour and I can't. Writing here's sort of a drug. It's the only thing I look forward to. This afternoon I read what I wrote. And it seemed vivid. I know it seems vivid because my imagination fills in all the bits another person wouldn't understand. I mean, it's vanity. But it seems sort of magic. And I just can't live in this present. I would go mad if I did. John Fowles, The Collector. Whew. Yep, 1/3 of the book left. Let me readjust my seat position. I'm gonna take a nice... Yeah, imagine this is the... What do you mean, Tyler? 3 hours? Oh God, no, Tyler. We started this book a while ago. I've been reading it in like bits and pieces. I'm just doing a really big push today because I didn't feel like playing games. So yeah, no. We were over halfway through when we started today. It's all good. You couldn't have known if you weren't like here during the other times. Okay. And I'm glad you're here this time too. I don't think we're gonna make it all through today. But I think if we keep pushing for another hour and a half today, I can probably finish it on Saturday. So we may do that. At some point, I'm going to do a bunch of things on Saturday, so it's not just going to be this. But maybe we hit the end of the night and I'll just read until the book's done. Maybe about like 10:30. depending on how far we get this time. I may need more time than that. All right. No worries. Part. So, part 3. 1. Chapter 32. Oh, blessed Jesus. Amo Ed made a convulsive movement forward. Jeffrey grasped his front arm. Steady beat of the drum pulsed. His head like something heard killing delirium. Bees drove around them, but one paused. They simply flew past to the clearing as if drawn by a mag, which Jeffrey... Oh, sickly. Hey. It's the chapter, but missing all the ends in case it wasn't. One of these times when I'm reading, I'm just gonna turn off all the redeems for my sanity. Either that or someone's gonna redeem Uwu Drought for Saturday, and I will be free for a day. I'm trying to read and have like a gentle night, and it's so loud. Two. Paul picked Paul picked up the typewriter and shook it. After a time, a small piece of steel fell out into the board across the arms of the wheelchair. He picked it up and looked at it. It was the letter T. The typewriter had just thrown its T. He thought, I'm going to complain to the management. I'm going to not just ask for a new typewriter, but fucking demand one. She's got the money. I know she does. Maybe it's squirreled away in fruit jars under the barn, or maybe it's stuffed in the walls at her laughing place. But she's got the dough. And T, my God, the second most common letter in the English language. Of course, he would ask Annie for nothing, much less demand. Once there had been a man who would have at least asked. A man who had been in a great deal more pain. A man who had nothing to hold on to, not even this shitty book. That man would have asked. Hurt or not, that man had the guts to at least try to stand up to Annie Wilkes. He had been that man, and he supposed he ought to be ashamed. But that man had 2 big advantages over this one. That man had 2 feet and 2 thumbs. Paul sat reflectively for a moment, reread the last line, mentally filling in the omissions, then simply went back to work. Better that way. Better not to ask. Better not to provoke. Outside his window, bees buzzed. It was the first day of summer. 3. Had been. Let me go, Ian snarled, and turned on Jeffrey, his right hand curling into a fist. His eyes bulged madly from his livid face, and he seemed totally unaware of who was holding him back from his darling. Jeffrey realized with cold certainty that what they had seen when Hezekiah pulled the protective screen of bushes aside from very close to driving Ian mad. He still tottered on the brink, and the slightest push would send him over. If that happened, he would take misery with him. Ian, let me go, I say. Ian pulled backward with furious strength, and Hezekiah moaned fearfully. No, boss. Make them bees crazy. Them sting. Missus. Ian seemed not to hear, eyes wild and blank. He lashed out at Jeffrey, striking his old friend high on the cheekbone. Black stars rocketed through Jeffrey's head. In spite of them, he saw Hezekiah beginning to swing the potentially deadly Gosha, a sand-filled bag the Burkas favored for close work, in time to hiss, No, let me handle this. Reluctantly, Hezekiah allowed the Gosha to subside to the end of its leather string like a slowing pendulum. Then Jeffrey's head was rocked by a fresh blow. This one mashed his lips against his teeth, and he felt the warm, salt-sweet taste of blood begin to seep into his mouth. There was a rough purring sound as Ian's dress shirt, now sun-faded and already torn in a dozen places, began to come apart in Jeffrey's grasp. In another moment, he would be free. Jeffrey realized with dazed wonder that it was the same shirt Ian had worn to the Baron and Baroness's dinner party 3 nights ago. Of course it was. There had been no opportunity to change since then. Not for Ian. Not for any of them. Only 3 nights ago. But the shirt looked as if Ian had been wearing it for at least 3 years, and Jeffrey felt as if at least 300 had passed since the party. Only 3 nights ago. He thought again with stupid wonder. Cat. One moment, I think. I got this from Dia. So I was holding my book in a place where she couldn't easily walk past because I was trying to keep her off of my desk, and she decided that instead of turning around and going elsewhere, that she was going to use my keyboard as her passage, and yeah. So. Oh, she gets quite chatty at night when I am up too late and it is past her bedtime. Hello, Floofer. Also, I've got a self-warming cat bed coming tomorrow. So basically, like, it's a material that absorbs and holds heat better than just cotton. And I'm going to be setting that up in the corner when I rearrange all of my stuff. So that we can have the Rubik's Cube. Oh, yeah. She sleeps on me at night, all night. Like, I go to sleep with her in one spot and I wake up and she's still there. Like, that is her favorite thing. Except the nights that she climbs under the blanket with me, because regular cuddling isn't enough. She must be as close to me as possible. I'm pretty sure if there were an additional option for her to, like, climb into my skin, she would. She is very, very much demanding of all of the attentions forever, but only from me. She dislikes every other human on the planet. She will let them, like, attend to her, so, like, give her food, play with her, give her treats, give her snackies, whatever. Pet her? God forbid. She's also extremely skittish, so, like, she scares herself if she makes a noise. Like, she'll push something off of my desk and it'll clatter onto the floor and she'll freak out because it made a noise. She will be dragging a stick from the living room, which is carpet, to the kitchen, which is tile. And as soon as the stick hits the tile, it makes a noise. She's like, oh my God, what is that? And runs away. Because she's insane. I do not know why she is so anxious all the time. Even now, like years later, but I suspect it has to do something with something that happened with the original other person I owned her with. Because when I had to be gone for... Or no, I didn't have to be gone. I couldn't bring Melody, the elderly cat, up the stairs with me because I was afraid she was going to fall. And she couldn't make it up the stairs by herself. The railing was too wide and she absolutely would have tried to jump down. So she had to stay downstairs. And it was like 4 days where they were taking care of her, and I was just kind of like having to help sort things out. And in those 4 days, I could tell that she had not been handled once, because she was just covered in little mats. I spent like 20 minutes brushing her out and had just a giant pile of fur because she just wasn't touched, and she can't clean herself. She's too old. So you have to, like, but I was always petting her all the time. So I was getting all of that loose fur out. So it didn't matter. But they didn't even try. And I was so livid at the time. And so I have no idea what might have happened with the babies, because I couldn't be around them 100% of the time. It got better. She ended her life in all the comfort in the world. She got everything she wanted. She was with me right up until the last second. So it all ended up okay. She was just old and frail. Hi, Mars. I mean, we're reading a horror novel, to be fair, so. And it just kind of started because Dia pranced across the keyboard and sent a message. Have a good day at work. Good luck. All right. Let me go, damn you. Ian drove his bloody fist in Jeffrey's face again and again. His friend, for whom, in his right mind, he would have died. Do you want to demonstrate your love for her by killing her? Jeffrey asked quietly. If you want to do that, then by all means, old boy, knock me senseless. Ian's fist hesitated. Something at least approximating sense came back into his terrified, maddened gaze. I must go to her, he murmured like a man in a dream. I'm sorry I hit you, Jeffrey. Truly sorry, my dear old man. And I'm sure you know it, but I must. You see her. He looked again, as if to confirm the dreadfulness of the sight, and again made as if to rush to where Misery had been tied to a post in a jungle clearing, her arms over her head, glimmering on her wrists and fastening her to the lowest branch of the eucalyptus, which was the only tree in the clearing, was something the Burkus had apparently taken a fancy to before sending Baron Hesdig into the mouth of the idol and to his undoubtedly terrible death. Baron's blue steel handcuffs. This time, it was Hezekiah who grabbed Ian. But the bushes rustled again, and Jeffrey looked into the clearing, his breath momentarily catching in his throat, as a bit of fabric may catch on a thorn. He felt like a man who must walk up a rocky hill with a load of decayed and dangerously volatile explosives in his arms. One sting, he thought. Just one, and it's all over for her. No, boss, mustn't, Hezekiah was saying, with a kind of terrified patience. It looked like to the boss be saying, if you go out there, the bees wake up from daydream. And if the bees wake, it don't matter for her if she done of one sting, 1 to 1,000 sting. Cyber, hello. What's up, what's up? Welcome to the horror novel that continues to be horror. Paul, our writer friend, just had his foot cut off, so there's that. In a gory detail. So that's fun. Anyway. If the bees wake up from daydreams, we all die. But she died first, and the most horrible. Little by little, Ian relaxed between the two men. One of them black, the other white. his head turned toward the clearing with dreadful reluctance, as if he did not wish to look, and yet could not forbear to. Then what are we to do? What are we to do for my poor darling? I don't know, came to Geoffrey's lips, and in his own state of terrible disastrous, he was able to bite them back. Not for the first time, it occurred to him that Ian's possession of the woman Geoffrey loved just as dearly, if secretly, allowed Ian to indulge in an odd sort of selfishness and an almost womanly hysteria that Geoffrey himself must forgo. After all, to the rest of the world, he was only Misery's friend. Yes, just her friend, he thought, with half-hysterical irony. And then his own eyes were drawn back to the clearing, to his friend. Misery wore not a stitch of clothing, yet Geoffrey thought that even the most prudish church-thrice-a-week village biddy could not have faulted her for her indecency. The hypothetical old prude might have run screaming from the sight of Misery, but her screams would have been caused by terror and revulsion, rather than outraged propriety. Misery wore not a stitch of clothing, but she was far from naked. She was dressed in bees. From the tips of her toes to the crown of her chestnut hair, she was dressed in bees. She seemed almost to be wearing some strange nun's habit. Strange because it moved and undulated across the swells of her breasts and hips, even though there was not even a ghost of a breeze. Likewise, her face seemed encased in a wimple of almost Mohammedan modesty. Only her blue eyes peered out of the mask of bees which crawled sluggishly over her face, hiding her mouth and nose and chin and brows. More bees, giant Africa browns, the most poisonous and bad-tempered bees in all the world, crawled back and forth over the barren steel bracelets before joining the living gloves on Misery's hands. As Geoffrey watched, more and more bees flew into the clearing from all points of the compass. Yet it was clear to him, even in his current distraction, that most of them were coming from the west, where the great dark stone face of the goddess loomed. The drums pulsed their steady rhythm, in its way as much a soporific as the sleepy drone of the bees. But Geoffrey knew how deceptive that sleepiness was. He had seen what happened to the Baroness, and only thanked God that Ian had been spared that. And the sound of that sleepy hum suddenly rising to the furious buzzsaw squeal, a sound which had at first muffled and then drowned to the woman's agonizing, dying screams. She had been a vain and foolish creature, dangerous as well. She had almost gotten them killed when she had freed Stringfellow's bushmaster. But silly or not, foolish or not, dangerous or not, no man or woman deserved to die like that. In his mind, Geoffrey echoed Ian's question. What are we to do? What are we to do for our poor darling? Hezekiah said, Nothing can do now, boss. But she in no danger. As long as the drums stay beat, the bees will sleep. And Miss Wish, she's gonna sleep too. Now the bees covered her in a thick and moving blanket. Her eyes, open but unseeing, seemed to be receding into a living cave of crawling, stumbling, droning bees. And if the drums stop? Geoffrey asked in a low, almost strengthless voice. And just then, the drums did. For a moment, Paul looked unbelievingly at the last line, then picked the royal up. He had gone on to lifting it like some weird barbell when she was out of the room. God knew why, and shook it again. The keys glittered, then another chunk of metal fell out of the board, which served as his desk. Outside, he could hear the roaring of Annie's bright blue riding lawnmower. She was around front, giving the grass a good trim so those cockadoodie Roydmans wouldn't have anything to talk about in town. He set the typewriter down, then rocked it out so he could fish out his new surprise. He looked at it in the strong, late-afternoon sunlight slanting through the window. His expression of disbelief never altered. Printed, in raised and slightly ink-stained metal on the head of the key was E. E. Just to add to the fun, the old royal had now thrown the most frequently used letter in the English language. Paul looked at the calendar. The picture was of a flowered meadow, and the month said May. But Paul kept his own dates now on a piece of scrap paper, and according to his homemade calendar, it was June 21st. Roll out those lazy, hazy, crazy days of summer, he thought sourly, and threw the key hammer in the general direction of the wastebasket. Well, what do I do now? He thought. But of course, he knew what came next. Longhand. That was what came next. But not now. Although he had been tearing along like a house afire a few seconds ago, anxious to get Ian, Jeffrey, and the ever-amusing Hezekiah caught in the Burkus ambush so that the entire party could be transported to the caves behind the face of the idol for the rousing finale, he was suddenly tired. The hole in the paper had closed with an adamant bang. Tomorrow. He would go to Longhand tomorrow. Fuck Longhand. Complain to the management, Paul. But he would do no such thing. Annie had gotten too weird. He listened to the monotonous snarl of the riding lawnmower, saw her shadow, and, as so often happened when he thought of how weird Annie was getting, his mind recalled the image of the axe rising, then falling. The image of her horrid, impassive, deadly face splattered with his blood. It was clear. Every word she had spoken, every word he had screamed, the squeal of the axe pulling away from the severed bone, blood on the wall. All crystal clear. And, as he also so often did, he tried to block this memory and found himself a second too late. Because the crucial plot twist of Fast Cars concerned Tony Bonsaro's near-fatal crack-up in his last desperate effort to escape the police, and this led to the epilogue, which consisted of the bruising interrogation conducted by the late Lieutenant Gray's partner in Tony's hospital room. Paul had interviewed a number of crash victims. He had heard the same thing time and time again, and came in different wrappers, but it always boiled down to the same thing. I remember getting into the car, and I remember waking up here. Everything else is a blank. Why couldn't that have happened to him? Because writers remember everything, Paul, especially the hurts. Strip a writer to the buff, point to the scars, and he'll tell you the story of each small one. From the big ones you get novels, not amnesia. A little talent is a nice thing to have if you want to be a writer, but the only real requirement is that ability to remember the story of every scar. Art consists of the persistence of memory. Who had said that? Thomas Zaz? William Faulkner? Cyndi Lauper? That last name brought its own association, a painful and unhappy one under these circumstances. A memory of Cyndi Lauper hiccuping her way cheerfully through Girls Just Want to Have Fun that was so clear it was almost auditory. Suddenly, he wanted a hit of rock and roll worse than anyone ever wanted a cigarette. It didn't have to be Cyndi Lauper. Anyone would do. Jesus Christ, Ted Nugent would be just fine. The axe coming down. The whisper of the axe. Don't think about it. That was stupid. He kept telling himself not to think about it, knowing all the while that it was there, like a bone in his throat. He was going to let it stay there, or he was going to be a man and stick the fucking thing up. Another memory came then. It seemed like it was an all-request oldies day for Paul Sheldon. This one was of Oliver Reed as the mad but silkily persuasive scientist in David Cronenberg's movie The Brood. Reed urging his patients at the Institute of Psychoplasmatics, a name Paul had found deliciously funny, to go through it, go all the way through it. Well, maybe sometimes that wasn't such bad advice. I went through it once. That was enough. Bullshit was what that was. If going through things once was enough, he would have been a fucking vacuum cleaner salesman like his father. Go through it then. Go all the way through it, Paul. Start with misery. No. Yes. Fuck you. Paul leaned back, put his hands over his eyes, and, like it or not, he began to go through it. All the way through it. 5. He hadn't died, hadn't slept, but for a while after Annie hobbled him, the pain went away. He had only drifted, feeling untethered from his body, a balloon of pure thought rising away from its string. Oh shit, why was he bothering? She had done it, and all the time between them now had been pain and boredom and occasional bouts of work on his stupidly melodramatic book to escape the former two. The whole thing was meaningless. Oh, but it's not. There's the theme here, Paul. It's the thread that runs through everything. The thread that runs so true. Can't you see it? Misery, of course. That was the thread that ran through everything. But true thread or false, it was so goddamn silly. A common noun, it meant pain. Usually lengthy and often pointless. As a proper one, it meant a character and a plot. The latter most assuredly lengthy and pointless, but one which would nonetheless end very soon. Misery ran through the last 4, or maybe it was 5, months of his life. All right. Plenty of misery. Misery day in and misery day out. But surely that was too simple, surely. Oh no, Paul. Nothing is simple about misery. Except that you owe her your life. Such as that may be. Because you turned out to be Shahrazad after all, didn't you? Again, he tried to turn aside from these thoughts, but found himself unable. The persistence of memory and all that. Max just want to have fun. Then an unexpected idea came. A new one, which opened a whole new avenue of thought. What you keep overlooking because it's so obvious is that you are, also Shahrazad to yourself. He blinked, lowering his hand and staring stupidly out the summer he had never expected he would see. Annie's shadow passed and then disappeared again. Is that true? Shahrazad to myself? He thought again. If so, then he was faced with an idiocy that was utterly colossal. He owed his survival to the fact that he wanted to finish this piece of shit Annie had coerced him into writing. He should have died, but couldn't. Not until he knew how it all came out. Oh, you're fucking crazy. You sure? No. He was no longer sure. Not about anything. With one exception. His whole life had hinged and continued to hinge on misery. He let his mind drift. The cloud, he thought. Begin with the cloud. Six. This time, the cloud had been darker, denser, somehow smoother. There was a sensation not of floating, but of sliding. Sometimes thoughts came, and sometimes there was pain. And sometimes, dimly, he heard Annie's voice, sounding the way it had when the burning manuscript in the barbecue had threatened to get out of control. Drink this, Paul. You've got to. Sliding? No, that's not quite the right verb. The right verb was sinking. He remembered a telephone call which had come at 3 a.m. This was when he was in college. Sleepy, 4th floor dorm proctor hammering on his door, telling him to come and answer the fucking phone. His mother. Come home as quick as you can, Paul. Your father had a bad stroke. He's sinking. And he had come as fast as he could, pushing his old Ford wagon to 70 in spite of the front end shimmy that developed at speeds over 50. But in the end, it had all been for nothing. When he got there, his father was no longer sinking, but sunk. How close did he himself come to sinking the night of the axe? He didn't know. But the fact that he had felt almost no pain during the week following the amputation was a pretty clear indication of how close, perhaps. That and the panic in her voice. He had lain in a semi-coma, barely breathing because of the respiratory depressant side effects of the medication. The glucose dripped back in his arm again, and what brought him out was the beat of drums and the drone of bees. Burka drums. Burka bees. Burka dreams. Color bleeding slowly and relentlessly into a land and a tribe that never were beyond the margins of the paper on which he wrote. A dream of the goddess, the face of the goddess, looming black over the jungle green, brooding and eroded. Dark goddess, dark continent, a stone head full of bees. Overlying even all this was a picture which grew clearer and clearer, as if a giant slide had been projected against the cloud in which he lay, as time passed. It was a picture of a clearing in which one old eucalyptus tree stood. Hanging from the lowest branch of this tree was an old-fashioned pair of blued steel handcuffs. Bees were crawling over them. The cuffs were empty. They were empty because Misery had escaped? She had, hadn't she? Wasn't that how the story was supposed to go? It had been, but now he wasn't so sure. Was that what those empty handcuffs meant? Or had she been taken away, taken into the idol, taken to the queen bee, the big babe of the Burkus? You were also Shahrazad to yourself. Who were you telling this story for, Paul? Who were you telling it to? To Annie? Of course not. He did not look through that hole in the paper to see Annie, or please Annie. He looked through it to get away from Annie. Pain had started, and the itch. The cloud began to lighten again and rift apart. He began to glimpse the room, which was bad, and Annie, which was even worse. Still, he had decided to live. Some part of him was as addicted to the chapter plays as Annie had been as a child, and had decided he could not die until he saw how it all came out. Had she escaped with the help of Ian and Jeffrey? Or had she been taken into the head of the goddess? It was ridiculous that these stupid questions seemed to need answering. 7. She didn't want to let him go back to work. Not at first. Hi, Jack. So nice to see you. How are you? How have you been? It's been a minute. Thank you for the tier 1. You're 4 months. That cannot be true. My God. Has it really been 4 months? Oh my goodness. You had a bad storm a week ago? Oh my gosh. Well, I'm glad to hear I'm glad you're okay in here. My brain is mixing things up. Had no internet? Oh my gosh, that's insane. That was really bad storm to take out infrastructure like that for so long. Wow. A tree took out one of the lines? Damn. I'm surprised they didn't have something in place to, like, fix that within a day or two, but I guess not. Well, welcome in. We are reading a horror novel. We are down to the last third-ish. A little over a quarter left, less than a third. Somewhere in between. But we're getting there. If I didn't have work tomorrow, I would probably just push through and read the rest, but no time for that. But we'll definitely finish it on Saturday. And then we'll have to pick a new book. So if anyone has any recommendations or requests, let me know. You're also free to use my Amazon list. I believe I have it set up where you can just send something. Throne as well. You can send anything and anything that's on Amazon. So if you have a book you'd like me to read, you can absolutely just send it my way and I will be happy to read it for you guys. If it's inappropriate, I might not be able to if it's not TOS approved. You gotta send it to me. Read and watched it. Scariness and the realism of a dangerously obsessive individual. Very true. Very true. Eh. What? I don't know what that is. Unhinged veteran Marine. Interesting. I think drugs also have some effect, and also, even if he does overpower her, that doesn't mean he can kill her. Because she knows all of his weak spots, and who knows what she has access to. Now he, and like at this point he's hobbled, so there's really not a lot that he can do. Anywho, we continue. And again, you can use my throne if you want to send a book for me to read, and it'll just come straight to me. Because I believe I have books and such enabled. I think I just turned off like clothes and NSFW things because no, thank you. I'm sure it would be very funny for like 20 seconds. And then I would be like, what the fuck do I do with this now? So, probably best not to have people. Oh, I believe it's one. Yes. Follow that link, and then I believe it gives you the option to send a surprise, and then you can search and at like if you scroll to the bottom, it says gifts from Amazon, so you can search anything that is on Amazon. Like by I believe also if you use the I'm not sure how it works exactly, but see if I can. Oh Jesus. I think that I had a link for the Amazon wish list. Guess not. Hold on. I'll have to. Hi, come. Doing all right. Doing all right. Getting our way through. Through Misery by Stephen King, as is on screen, and somebody was asking about wishlist and sending me books. I need to manage. Yeah, let buyers ship additional items not on this list. So, let me share. Copy link. There's Amazon. I'm not quite sure how the Amazon thing works, but it is enabled that you can send anything, so. I know not. 'Tis not my, forte. But what I can do before we continue, have a snowball fight with yourself? That's funny. Okay, perfect. Now we have Command Amazon, so I have Command Wishlist for Throne and Command Amazon for Amazon. Yay! I did thing. Animals. Yeah, I don't know how the Throne thing works. Really. Exactly. But it exists, so. Yeah, no. I should add presents for the babies. Oh, I could maybe add kitty treats. So that when they're in the spot, I can feed them treats that people have sent them. I think that sounds like a good idea. I'll do that later. If I remember. We shall see. But anyway, book 7. She didn't want to let him go back to work. Not at first. He could see in her skittery eyes how frightened she had been and still was, how close he had come. She was taking extravagant care of him, changing the bandages on his weeping stump every 8 hours, and at first she had informed him, with the air of one who knows she will never get a medal for what she has done. Although she deserves one, she had done it every 4 hours, giving him sponge baths and alcohol rubs as if to deny what she had done. Work, she said, would hurt him. It would put you back, Paul. I wouldn't say it if I weren't so. Believe me. Or if it weren't so. Believe me. At least you know what's ahead. I'm dying to find out what happens next. It turned out she had read everything he had written. All his pre-surgery work, you might say. While he lingered near death. Better than 300 manuscript pages. He hadn't filled in the ends in the last 40 or so. Annie had done that. She showed him these with an uneasily defiant sort of pride. Her ends were textbook neat, a striking comparison with his own, which had degenerated into a humpbacked scrawl. Although Annie never said so, he believed she had filled in the ends either as another evidence of her solicitude. How can you say I was cruel to you, Paul, when you see all the ends I have filled in? Or as an act of atonement, or possibly even as a quasi-superstitious rite. Enough bandage changes, enough sponge baths, enough ends filled in, and Paul would live. Work could be woman work powerful. Mojo magic. Wanna fill in all these nanny ends, and all will be well again. That was how she had begun. But then the gotta set in. Paul knew all the symptoms. When she said she was dying to find out what happened next, she wasn't kidding. It's because you went on living to find out what happened next. Isn't that what you're really saying? Crazy as it was, shameful even in its absurdity, he thought it was. The gotta. It was something he had been irritated to find he could generate in nursery books almost at will, but in his mainstream fiction erratically or not at all. You didn't know exactly where to find the gotta, but you always knew when you did. It made the needle of some internal Geiger counter swing all the way over to the end of the dial. Even sitting in front of the typewriter, slightly hungover, drinking cups of black coffee and crunching a rollade or two every couple of hours, knowing he should give up the fucking cigarettes at least in the morning, but unable to bring himself to the sticking point. Months from finishing and light years from publication, you knew the gotta when you got it. Having it always made him feel slightly ashamed, manipulative, but it also made him feel vindicated in his labor. Christ, days went by and the hole in the paper was small, the light was dim. He overheard conversations witless. You pushed on because that was all you could do. Confucius say if man wants to grow 1 row of corn, first must shovel 1 ton of shit. And then one day the hole widened to VistaVision width, and the light shone through like a sun ray in a Cecil B. DeMille epic, and you knew you had the gotta alive and kicking. The gotta, as in, I think I'll stay up another 15-20 minutes, honey. I gotta see how this chapter comes out. Even though the guy who says it spent the day at work thinking about getting laid and knows the odds are good his wife is going to be asleep when he finally gets up to the bedroom. The gotta, as in, I know I should be starting supper now. He'll be mad if it's TV dinners in, but I gotta see how this ends. I gotta know, will she live? I gotta know, will she catch the shitheel who killed his father? I gotta know if she finds out her best friend's screwing her husband. The gotta. Nasty as a hand job at a sleazy bar, fine as a fuck from the world's most talented call girl. Oh boy, it was bad, and oh boy, it was good. And oh boy, in the end, it didn't matter how rude it was or how crude it was, because in the end, it was just like the Jacksons said on that record. Don't stop till you get enough. 8. You were also Shahrazad to yourself. That was not an idea he was able to articulate or even understand. Not then. He had been in too much pain. But he had known just the same, hadn't he? Not you. The guys in the sweatshop. They knew. Yes. That had the ring of the right. The sound of the riding mower swelled louder. Annie came back into view for a moment. She looked at him, saw him looking back, and raised a hand to him. He raised one of his own. The one with the thumb still on it. In return. She passed from sight again. Good deal. He was finally able to convince her that returning to work would put him forward, not back. He was haunted by the specificity of those images which had lured him out of the cloud. And haunted was exactly the right word, until they were written down. They were shades which would remain unlaid. And while she hadn't believed him, not then, she had allowed him to go back to work just the same. Not because he had convinced her, but because of the gotta. At first, he had been able to work only in painfully short bursts. 15 minutes, maybe half an hour if the story really demanded it of him. Even short bursts were agony. A shift in position caused the stump to come brightly alive, the way a smoldering brand will burst into flame when fanned by a breeze. It hurt furiously while he wrote. That was not the worst. The worst was the hour or two afterward when the healing stuff would madden him with a drony itch like swarming sleepy bees. He had been right, not her. He never became really well. Probably could not do so in such situation. But his health did improve and some of his strength came back. He was aware that the horizons of his interest had shrunk. That he accepted this as the price of survival. It was a genuine wonder he had survived at all. Sitting here in front of this typewriter with its increasingly bad teeth, looking back over a period which had consisted of work rather than events. Paul nodded. Yes, he supposed he had been his own Shahrazad. Just as he was his own dream woman when he grabbed hold of himself and jacked off to the feverish beat of his fantasies. He didn't need a psychiatrist to point out that writing had its autoerotic side. You beat a typewriter instead of your meat, but both acts depended largely on quick wits, fast hands, and a heartfelt commitment to the art of the far-fetched. But hadn't there also been some sort of fuck, even if the driest variety? Because once he started again, well, she wouldn't interrupt him while he was working. But she would take each day's outputs as soon as he was done, ostensibly to fill in the missing letters, but actually, he knew this by now, just as sexually acute men know which dates will put out at the end of the evening and which ones will not. To get her fix. To get her gotta. The chapter place. Yes, back to that. Only for the last few months, she's been going every day instead of just on Saturday afternoons, and the Paul who takes her is her pet writer instead of her older brother. His stints at the typewriter grew gradually longer as the pain slowly receded and some of his endurance returned. But ultimately, he wasn't able to write fast enough to satisfy her demands. Legata, which had kept both of them alive, and it had, for without it, she surely would have murdered both him and herself long since, was also what caused the loss of his thumb. It was horrible, but also sort of funny. You have a little irony, Paul. It's good for your blood. And think how much worse it could have been. It could have been his penis, for instance. And I only have one of those, he said, and began to laugh wildly in the empty room in front of the hateful royal with its gap-toothed grin. He laughed until his gut and stump both ached. Laughed until his mind ached. At some point, the laughter turned to horrible, dry sobs that awoke pain even in what remained of his left thumb. And when that happened, he was finally able to stop. He wondered in a dull sort of way how close he was to going insane. Not that it really mattered, he supposed. 9. One day, not long before the thumbectomy, perhaps even less than a week, Annie had come in with 2 giant dishes of vanilla ice cream, a can of Hershey's chocolate syrup, a pressure can of Ready Whip, and a jar in which maraschino cherries red as a heart's blood floated like biology specimens. I thought I'd make us sundaes, Paul, Annie said. Her tone was surreptitiously jolly. Surreptitiously. Paul didn't like it. Not her tone of voice, nor the uneasy look in her eyes. I'm being a naughty girl, that look said. It made him wary. Put his wind up. It was easy for him to imagine her looking exactly the same way when she put a heap of clothes on one set of stairs, a dead cat on another. Why, thank you, Annie, he said, and watched as she poured the syrup and puffed 2 cumulus clouds of whipped cream out of the pressure can. She performed these chores with the practiced, heavy hand of a long-time sugar junkie. No need for thanks. You deserve it. You've been working so hard. She gave him his sundae. Sweetness became cloying after the 3rd bite, but he kept on. It was wiser. One of the key rules to survival here on the scenic western slope was, to wit, when Annie's treatin', you best be eatin'. There was silence for a while, and then Annie put her spoon down, wiped a mixture of chocolate syrup and melting ice cream off her chin with the back of her hand, and said pleasantly, Tell me the rest. Paul put his own spoon down. I beg your pardon? Tell me the rest of the story. I can't wait. I just can't. Hi, Eddie. How are you? Guys, it's my favorite idiot here to join us in the reading of the book. Hello, hello. You're about to get to more violence, as horror novels are wont to do. The thing I'm doing for everyone. And hadn't he known this was coming? Yes. If someone had delivered all 20 reels of the new Rocket Man chapter play to Annie's house, she would have waited, parceling out only one a week, or even one a day. He looked at the half-demolished avalanche of her sundae. One cherry almost buried in whipped cream, another floating in chocolate syrup. He remembered the way the living room had looked, with sugar-glazed dishes everywhere. No, Annie was not the waiting type. Annie would have watched all 20 episodes in one night, even if they gave her eye strain and a splitting headache. Because Annie loved sweet things. I can't do that, he said. Her face darkened at once. But hadn't there been a shadowy relief there as well? Oh? Why not? Because you wouldn't respect me in the morning, he thought of saying, and clamped down on that. Clamped down hard. Because I'm a rotten storyteller, he answered instead. She slurped up the remainder of her sundae in 5 huge spoonfuls that would have left Paul's throat gray with frostbite. Then she set her dish down and looked at him angrily. Not as if he were the great Paul Sheldon, but if he were someone who had presumed to criticize the great Paul Sheldon. If you're such a rotten storyteller, how come you have the bestsellers and millions of people love the books you write? I didn't say I was a rotten story writer. I actually happen to think I'm pretty good at that. But as a storyteller, I'm the pits. You're just making up a big cockadoodie excuse. Her face was darkening. Her hands were clenched into shiny fists on the heavy material of her skirt. Hurricane Annie was back in the room. Everything that went around came around. Except things no longer had been quite the same, had they? He was scared of her as ever, but her hold over him had nonetheless diminished. His life no longer seemed like such a big deal. Gotta or no gotta. He was only afraid she would hurt him. It's not an excuse, he had replied. The two things were like apples and oranges, Annie. People who tell stories usually can't write stories. If you think people who can write stories can talk worth a damn, you've never watched some poor slob of a novelist fumbling his way through an interview on the Today Show. Well, I don't want to wait, she sulked. I made you that nice sundae, and the least you could do is tell me a few things. Did the Baron kill Calthorpe? Her eyes sparkled. That's one thing I really want to know. And what did he do with the body if he did? Is it all cut up in the trunk? In that trunk his wife won't let out of her sight? That's what I think. Paul shook his head, not to indicate she had it wrong, but to indicate he would not tell. She became even blacker, yet her voice was soft. You're making me very angry. You know that, don't you, Paul? Of course I know. But I can't help it. Right. I could make you. I could make you help it. I could make you tell. But she looked frustrated, as if knowing that she could not. She could make him say some things, but she could not make him tell. Annie, do you remember telling me what a little kid says to his mother when she catches him playing with the cleaning fluid under the sink and makes him stop? Mommy, you're mean. Isn't that what you're saying now? Paul, you're mean. If you make me much better, I don't promise to be responsible, she said. But he sensed the crisis was already past. She was strangely vulnerable to these concepts of discipline and behavior. Well, I'll have to chance that, he said, because I'm just like that mother. I'm not saying no to be mean or to spite you. I'm saying no because I really want you to like the story. And if I give you what you want, you won't like it. And you won't want it anymore. And then what will happen to me, Annie? He thought, but did not say. Oh, I'm not reading that line. Ha! Oh! I did not know that that was in here. I forgot about that. So, the line is, at least tell me if that N-word, Hezekiah, really does know where Misery's father is. At least tell me that. Oh, yeah. Well, this book was published quite a long time ago. Yeah, 1987, so probably not as much of a problem back then. I'm not saying that. So, I'm gonna go on to the next one. Do you want the novel, or do you want me to fill out a questionnaire? Don't you take that sarcastic tone to me. Then don't you pretend you don't understand what I'm saying, he shouted back. She recoiled from him in surprise and unease. Maybe, but still. Still. Ugh. Yeah, well, when it has the N-word in it, I'm not saying it. Like, I know I am reading the book, but also, like, no. I am, like, painfully white. for one. And two, I have enough respect for people to not say it. Like, at all. No, it's not happening. No links. Anywho, we continue, because hopefully that's the only time that comes up. If it does happen again, I will just say N-word and we won't move on, but understand that it has been written out. Fully. She recoiled from him in surprise and unease, the last of that blackness going out of her face, and all that was left was a weird little girl look, that I've been naughty look. You want to cut open the golden goose. That's what comes down to. But when the farmer in the story finally did, all that he had was a dead goose and a bunch of worthless guts. All right, she said. All right, Paul. Gonna finish your sundae? I can't eat anymore, he said. I see. I've upset you. I'm sorry. I expect you're right. I was wrong to ask. She was perfectly calm again. He had half expected another period of deep depression or rage to follow, but none had. They had simply gone back to the old routine. Paul writing, Annie reading each day's output, and enough time had passed between the argument and the thumectomy that Paul had missed the connection. Until now. I bitched about the typewriter, he thought, looking at it now and listening to the drone of the mower. It sounded fainter now, and he was marginally aware that wasn't because Annie was moving away, but because he was. He was drowsing off. He had thought a lot now, simply drowsed off like some old fart in a nursing home. Not a lot. I only bitched about it that once. But once was enough, wasn't it? More than enough. Was that, what, a week after she brought those Yugi Sundays? Just about that. Just 1 week and one bitch. And how the clunk of that dead key was driving me crazy. I didn't even suggest she get another used typewriter from Nancy Whoremonger or whatever the woman was, one with all its keys intact. I just said these clunks are driving me crazy, and then in almost no time at all, presto changeo. When it comes to Paul's left thumb, now you see it and now you don't. Except she didn't really do it because I bitched about the typewriter, did she? She did it because I told her no, and she had to accept that. It was an act of rage. The rage was the result of realization. What realization? Why, that she didn't hold all the cards after all. But I had a certain passive hold over her. The power of the Gata. I turned out to be a pretty passable Shazarad after all. It was crazy. It was funny. It was also real. Millions might scoff, but only because they failed to realize how pervasive the influence of art, even such a degenerate sort as popular fiction, could become. Housewives arranged their schedules around the afternoon soaps. If they went back into the workplace, they made buying a VCR a top priority so they could watch those same soap operas at night. When Arthur Conan Doyle killed Sherlock Holmes at Reichenbach Falls, all of Victorian England rose as one and demanded him back. The tone of their protests had been Annie's exactly. Not bereavement, but outrage. Doyle was berated by his own mother when he wrote and told her of his intention to do away with Holmes. Her indignant reply had come by return mail. Kill that nice Mr. Holmes? Foolishness, don't you dare. Or there was the case of his friend Gary Rudman, who worked for the Boulder Public Library. When Paul had dropped over to see him one day, he had found Gary's shades drawn and a black crepe fluff on the door. Concerned, Paul had knocked hard until Gary answered, "Go away," Gary had told him. "I'm feeling depressed today. Someone died. Someone important to me." When Paul asked whom, Gary had responded tiredly, "Vander Valk." Paul heard him walk away from the door, and although he knocked again, Gary had not come back. Vander Valk, it turned out, was a fictional detective created, and then uncreated, by a writer named Nicholas Freeling. Paul had been convinced Gary's reaction had been more than false. He thought it had been pretentiously artsy. In short, a pose. He continued to feel this way until 1983 when he read The World According to Garp. He made the mistake of reading the scene where Garp's younger son dies, impaled on a gearshift lever shortly before bed. It was hours before he slept. The scene would not leave his mind. The thought that grieving for a fictional character was absurd did more than cross his mind during his tossings and turnings. For grieving was exactly what he was doing, of course. The realization had not helped, however, and this had caused him to wonder if perhaps Gary Redman hadn't been a lot more serious about Vandervalk than Paul had given him credit for at the time. And this had caused another memory to resurface. Finishing William Golding's Lord of the Flies at the age of 12 on a hot summer day, going to the refrigerator for a cold glass of lemonade, and then suddenly changing direction and speeding up from an amble to an all-out bolt, which had ended in the bathroom where he had leaned over the toilet and vomited. Paul suddenly remembered other examples of this odd mania. The way people had mobbed the Baltimore docks each month when the packet bearing the new installment of Mr. Dickens' Little Dorrit or Oliver Twist was due. Some had drowned, but this did not discourage the others. The old woman of 105 who had declared she would live until Mr. Galsworthy finished the Forsyte Saga, and who had died less than an hour after having the final page of the final volume read to her. The young mountain climber hospitalized with the supposedly fatal case of hypothermia whose friends had read The Lord of the Rings to him non-stop, around the clock, until he came out of his coma. Hundreds of other such incidents. Every best-selling writer of fiction would, he supposed, have his own personal examples of radical reader involvement with the make-believe world the writer creates. Examples of the Shazarad complex, Paul thought now, half dreaming as the sound of Annie's mower ebbed and flowed at some great echoing distance. He remembered getting 2 letters suggesting misery theme parks, on the order of Disney World or Great Adventure. One of these letters had included a crude blueprint. But the blue ribbon winner, at least until Annie Wilkes had entered his life, had been Mrs. Roman D. Sandpiper III of Ink Beach, Florida. Mrs. Roman D. Sandpiper, whose given name was Virginia, had turned an upstairs room of her home into Misery's parlor. She included Polaroids of Misery's spinning wheel, Misery's espresso, complete with a half-completed bread and butter note to Mr. Favre, saying she would be in attendance at the school hall recreation on the 20th November. Done in what Paul thought was an eerily apt hand for his heroine, not a round and flowing lady script, but a half-feminine copperplate. Misery's couch, Misery's sampler, let love instruct you, do not presume to instruct love, etc., etc. The furnishings, Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper's letter said, were all genuine, not pre-reductions, and while Paul could not tell for sure, he guessed that it was the truth. If so, this expensive bit of make-believe must have cost Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper thousands of dollars. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper hastened to assure him that she was not using his character to make money, nor did she have any plans in that direction, heaven forbid. But she did want him to see the pictures, and to tell her what she had done wrong, which she was sure must be a great deal. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper also hoped for his opinion. Looking at these pictures had given him a feeling which was strange yet eerily intangible. It had been like looking at photographs of his own imagination. And he knew from that moment on, whenever he tried to imagine Misery's little combination parlor and study, Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper's Polaroids would leap immediately into his mind, obscuring imagination with their cheery but one-dimensional concreteness. Tell her what was wrong? That was madness. From now on, he would be the one to wonder about that. He had written back a brief note of congratulation and admiration, a note which hinted not at all certain questions concerning Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper, which had crossed his mind. How tightly wrapped was she, for instance? And had received another letter in return, with a fresh slew of Polaroids. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper's first communication had consisted of a 2-page handwritten letter and 7 Polaroids. The second consisted of a 10-page handwritten letter and 40 Polaroids. The letter was exhaustive and ultimately exhausting. Manual of where Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper had found each piece, how much she had paid, and the restoration process involved. Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper told him that she had found a man named McKibben who owned an old squirrel rifle and had gotten him to put the bullet hole in the wall by the chair. While she could not swear to the historical accuracy of the gun, yes, it is here. I asked how he was, and he said he was good, so I figured that meant that all was well in the land of whatever had gone wrong. Did not press further. I mean, he can see your messages, so it's up to him if he feels like answering. While she could not swear to the historical accuracy of the gun, Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper admitted she knew the caliber was right. The pictures were mostly close detail shots, but for the handwritten captions on the back, they could have been photos in one of those "What is this picture?" features in puzzle magazines, where maxi photography makes the straight arm of a paperclip look like a pylon and the pop top of a beer can look like a Picasso sculpture. Paul had not answered this letter, but that had not turned Mrs. Roman D. Virginia Sandpiper, who had sent 5 more, first 4 with additional Polaroids, before lapsing into puzzled, slightly hurt silence. The last letter had been stiffly signed Mrs. Roman D. Sandpiper. The invitation, however, parenthetically made, to call her Virginia, had been withdrawn. The woman's feelings, obsessed though they might have been, had never evolved into Annie's paranoid fixation. But Paul understood now that the wellspring had been the same, the Shazarad complex, the deep and elemental drawing power of the Gata. His floating deepened. He slept. Okay. We have 80 pages left. Let's see how much we have gotten through today. I'm not quite sure. We got through about 75, so yeah, I should be able to maybe a little bit more. Yeah. So we absolutely should be able to finish on Saturday, but my throat is starting to get sore. So I am going to call it there and rest my voice and prepare for the next couple of days. But we're going to finish Misery on Saturday. So I will start reading around, we'll say 10:30 p.m. Central. And we will go until it is done. And then once we finish Misery, that will be the end of the birthday stream shenanigans. I may, if you guys want me to keep going after the 21st and like keep going into the night, I may put up some kind of like stretch goal, something. If not, if you guys just want to finish the book and then go to bed, that is a-okay too. Or if you want to like hit a goal to make me stream on Sunday too. But I think we'll probably just be done at the end of Saturday. But yeah, I am going to call it there for now. I appreciate everyone being here while I was just reading this good but very chaotic, and that's the wrong button. I don't know how buttons work. Yay. Anyway, that is going to be it for me today, everybody. I really appreciate everyone sticking around, hanging out, being here in general. I hope you enjoyed the reading, and I hope you'll enjoy whatever craziness has for us in the next couple of days. I know on Saturday I am planning, at least for some time, playing Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. I will be doing the part of the bomb diffuser, and if anyone would like to join in the chaos of providing me bomb diffusing instructions from the instruction manual while not watching the screen, do let me know. Sky will be participating as the bomb diffusal expert primary. I'm gonna try to get a hold of Hijinks and have him join in too, and then because you can have as many people looking through the manual as possible, but only one person gets to control the bomb. So we kind of have to set up a good system. So that will be midday on Saturday, and then we'll probably do that in the middle of the day. I'm gonna do something probably pretty chill in the morning. I'm not sure what yet, and then after we get done with diffusing bombs, might do open lobbies of DBD until book time comes, or if anybody has any suggestions, requests, or demands, I suppose, of another game that you would like me to play, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all again tomorrow. I love you all so very much. Have a good one, everyone. Oh, bye-bye, and good night.